I have lived my entire life beneath the sun and never seen it once. This is not a metaphor. This is not some poetic expression of spiritual darkness or emotional despair. This is a simple statement of fact. Somewhere above me, 18047 levels up through plasteel and rockcrete and the compressed weight of 80 billion human souls, there is a star that provides light and warmth to the upper reaches of Hive Primus. I know this because the tech priests say so in their sermons. I know this because the work schedules are divided into day and night shifts, though down here the only difference is whether the bioluminescent fungus is at full growth or dim cycle. I know this because sometimes when the air recyclers malfunction and the atmospheric pressure drops just right, you can smell something on the wind that the old-timers call sky. But I have never seen it. I will never see it. I was born in darkness, and I will die in darkness. And the 19 standard years between have been measured not in sunrises, but in the sickly green glow of the fungus farms that provide the only light our level knows. My name is Kyle Torrens, though names matter less down here than they do above. What matters is your production quota, your water ration number, your HAB block designation. I am Unit K7743 in the manufacturing records. I am Compartment 89J in the Housing Allocation Database. I am a statistical probability in the mortality projections that the Administratum uses to calculate how many bodies Level 1047 can sustain before the recycling systems become overwhelmed. I work the fungus farms in Sector 12, tending the massive cultivation chambers where bioengineered organisms grow in the dark, feeding on chemical runoff from the levels above and corpse matter from the levels below. The work is simple, mindless, and absolutely essential. The fungus provides protein paste for our rations, produces the faint light that keeps us from total blindness, and processes the toxic waste that would otherwise accumulate until it poisoned us all. Without the farms, level 1847 would die in a matter of weeks. With the farms, we can sustain our miserable existence indefinitely. The cultivation chambers stretch for kilometers in every direction, vast caverns carved from the hive's foundation rock and lined with growing medium that squelches wetly underfoot. The fungus itself grows in sheets and towers and strange geometric formations that seem to pulse with their own rhythm. It glows with a phosphorescent green light that casts everything in shades of sickness and decay. In this light, human skin looks corpse pale, blood appears black, and the moisture that condenses on every surface gleams like the sweat of something dying. I have been working the farm since I was 7 years old, when my growth rate metrics indicated I was large enough to be useful. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week, with the 7th reserved for mandatory spiritual compliance lectures from the ecclesiarchy missionaries who descend from the upper levels once a month to remind us that our suffering serves the emperor. The work has shaped my body in specific ways. My hands are stained permanent green from the fungus spores. My back is bent from years of stooping beneath low ceilings. My lungs carry a permanent rasp from breathing air thick with biological particulate matter. By the time I'm 30, I'll look 50. By the time I'm 40, I'll be dead. This is normal. This is expected. This is life on level 1847. The HAB compartment I share with 23 other workers is a rectangular space, 7 meters long, 4 meters wide, and just tall enough to stand upright if you're shorter than average. We sleep in shifts, hot bunking in sleeping alcoves stacked 4 high along the walls. The air smells of unwashed bodies, chemical cleanser, and the ever-present rot-sweet scent of the fungus that permeates everything down here. Privacy is a concept that belongs to the upper levels. Down here, You learn to perform every bodily function within arm's reach of your neighbors, to sleep through the sounds of others' nightmares, to pretend not to notice when someone weeps quietly in the darkness. Food comes twice per day, a gray paste dispensed from communal feeding stations, processed from the fungus harvest, and supplemented with corpse starch rendered from the previous week's dead. The taste is difficult to describe to someone who has never experienced it. Imagine the flavor of recycled protein, chemical preservatives, and the faint metallic sweetness that suggests the corpse starch was rendered from bodies that died of heavy metal poisoning. Now imagine eating nothing else for 19 years. Your tongue forgets what variety means. Your stomach adapts to accept nutrition from sources that would make an upper hiver vomit. You learn to be grateful for the paste, because the alternative is starvation, and starvation is a death that takes weeks and leaves your body too toxic to be properly recycled. Water is rationed with religious precision. Each worker receives 4 liters per day, half a liter for drinking, the rest for washing and waste management. The water comes from reclamation stations that process sewage, industrial runoff, and condensation harvested from the hive's cooling systems. It tastes of rust and chemicals, and something organic that you try not to think about too carefully. The tech priests assure us it's safe, that the filtration systems remove 97% of harmful contaminants. The remaining 3% is an acceptable risk factor, statistically insignificant compared to the certainty of death from dehydration. I learned to stop thinking about what I was eating and drinking around the age of 12. The alternative was madness, a complete psychological breakdown that I witnessed in others who couldn't reconcile the reality of their situation with the human instinct for dignity and cleanliness. There was a woman named Essa who worked the same shift rotation. She started refusing to eat the corpse starch, claiming she could taste her dead husband in the paste. She lasted 3 weeks before malnutrition drove her into delirium. The last time I saw her, she was being carried to the corpse processing station, still alive but too weak to protest, her body already designated for next week's rations. The tech priests explained that wasting a living body served no purpose when that body could be converted to usable nutrition. They were not cruel about it. They simply followed protocol, their enhanced brains incapable of recognizing the horror of recycling someone who was still breathing. This is the ordinary horror of level 1847. Not the dramatic nightmare of chaos corruption or Xeno's invasion, but the slow grinding degradation of human existence compressed into spaces too small and fed resources too scarce. We live on top of each other, beneath each other, pressed together in corridors designed for half our number, breathing air that has passed through 1,000,000 other lungs, eating food rendered from 1,000,000 other bodies. The hive is a machine that consumes human beings and converts them into the minimum amount of labor and biomass necessary to keep itself functioning. We are not citizens. We are not even really people. We are components, organic machinery, self-replicating units that maintain the infrastructure until we break down and get recycled into the next generation. And yet, we persist. Humanity's ability to adapt to horror is remarkable, terrifying in its own way. Within a year of being assigned to the fungus farms, I had stopped thinking of my situation as unusual. Within 5 years, I had forgotten that any other kind of life was possible. The upper levels became myth. Stories told by the old-timers who claimed to have once worked higher in the hive before some infraction dropped them into the depths. The sun became a religious concept, something the God Emperor provided to the worthy while we suffered in darkness to prove our devotion. I was 19 years old, and I had never questioned the system. Never wondered why some people lived in light while others lived in darkness. Never asked why the hive needed 1084 7 levels, or why the lowest levels were left to rot in conditions that barely sustained life. These questions were not forbidden exactly. They simply never occurred to me. The scope of my world extended to the fungus farms, the Hive compartment, and the narrow corridors connecting them. Beyond that was just more darkness, more levels, more compartments full of people like me grinding away their lives in service to a machine too vast to comprehend. The day everything changed started like any other. I woke to the sound of the shift change klaxon, extracted myself from my sleeping alcove without disturbing the worker climbing in to replace me, and joined the stream of bodies moving through the corridors toward the fungus farms. The bioluminescent growth was in full cycle, casting its sick green light across thousands of faces, rendered identical by exhaustion and despair. We moved in silence, a river of human flesh flowing through arteries of plasteel and rockcrete, each of us alone in the press of bodies. The water reclamation station stood at the intersection of 3 major corridors, a vital node in the infrastructure that kept Level 1847 alive. It was a squat building of reinforced plasteel, heavily armored against the kind of casual vandalism that occasionally erupted when rations were cut or shift schedules were extended. The tech priest who maintained it lived inside, never leaving, his augmented body requiring only minimal nutrition and his mechanical mind incapable of the boredom that would drive a normal human insane. I was passing the station when they hit it. The first sign was the sound, not an explosion, but something worse. The shriek of industrial cutting equipment biting through plasteel, the hiss of hydraulics, the organized chaos of people working with brutal efficiency. Then came the smell. Burning metal, promethium fuel, and underneath it all, the copper stink of blood. The gang came through the corridor like a tactical strike force, 20 figures moving with coordinated precision that spoke of military training or long practice. They wore armor cobbled together from industrial equipment, manufacturum cast-offs, and scavenged flak plates. Their weapons were equally improvised. Stub guns, improvised explosives, industrial nail guns modified for lethality, last cutters, repurposed into crude energy weapons. But what struck me most was their faces. They wore masks fashioned from fungus leather and scrap metal, each one unique, transforming them from individuals into something tribal and terrifying. The other workers scattered immediately, pressing themselves against the corridor walls or fleeing down side passages. This was the learned response. Gang activity was a fact of life in the Underhive, as natural and inevitable as the recycling of corpses or the rationing of water. You didn't interfere. You didn't watch. You made yourself small and invisible and prayed they weren't interested in you. But I couldn't look away. The gang breached the reclamation station in under 2 minutes. The cutting equipment sliced through the armored door like it was designed specifically for this purpose, which it probably was. Inside, I could hear the tech priest's mechanical voice raising some kind of alarm or prayer to the Omnissiah, the words distorted by vox corruption and rising panic. Then came the sound of gunfire, short controlled bursts that echoed through the corridor with professional discipline. The tech priest emerged from the station in pieces. They dragged his torso out first, cables trailing behind like metallic intestines, his remaining augmented arms still clutching some kind of ceremonial cogwheel. His lower half followed separately, carried by 2 gangers who moved with the casual indifference of workers hauling scrap metal. The tech priest was still alive, his mechanical parts keeping his organic components functional despite the catastrophic trauma. His remaining eye, glowing with a pale blue light, swept across the corridor until it found me. Alert! Adeptus Arbites. Protocol. Violation. His voice was failing, the Vox unit damaged, but the intent was clear. He wanted someone to report this, to summon the law, to restore order to a system that was supposed to be inviolable. One of the gangers, a woman with a mask that resembled a snarling canid, placed her boot on the tech priest's chest and fired a single round into his remaining eye. The light went out. The voice stopped. What remained was just metal and meat, resources to be stripped and recycled. "Water's ours now," the woman announced, her voice carrying down the corridor with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Rust. Vipers control this station. Tariff is 2 ration chits per liter, payment in advance. Anyone who doesn't like the terms is welcome to try their luck with the Arbites." She knew, of course, that no one would. The Adeptus Arbites barely maintained a presence this deep in the Hive. They would investigate eventually, file a report, perhaps execute a few random underhivers to satisfy the appearance of justice. But they wouldn't restore the water station to free access. They wouldn't punish the gang. The cost of maintaining order at this depth exceeded the value of the resources being fought over. The gangs were allowed to exist because they performed a function the Imperium found useful. They imposed order where official authority was too expensive to maintain. They regulated population through violence. They controlled resources through intimidation. They were, in their way, as much a part of the Hive's designed function as the water reclamation systems themselves. The other workers accepted this immediately. They would pay the tariff or find another water source or reduce their consumption. They would adapt because adaptation was the only survival strategy the Underhive permitted. But something in me broke in that moment, watching the tech priest's body being stripped for useful components while his blood pooled on the deck plating. Not broken with horror or moral outrage, broken with understanding. This was the truth of our existence. There was no order here, no protection, no guarantee that following the rules would keep you safe. The Imperium demanded our labor and our bodies, but it offered nothing in return except the minimal resources necessary to keep us productive until we died. And in the spaces where imperial authority didn't reach, the gangs ruled with the same brutal efficiency, the same cold calculation of resources and bodies. The woman with the canned mask was walking back down the corridor when she noticed me. Most of the other workers had already fled or were pressed against the walls with eyes averted. But I was standing in the middle of the corridor, staring at the corpse, trying to process what I had just witnessed. She stopped, cocked her head, studied me with eyes that glinted behind the mask's eye holes. "You got a problem, meat?" The term was casual, dismissive. Meat. That's what we were to then. Raw material, resources on legs. I should have looked away, should have mumbled an apology and melted into the crowd. But the understanding that had broken something in me also freed something. A reckless clarity that comes from realizing you've been living a lie. "No problem," I heard myself say. "Just wondering why you left his augmetic arm. Looks like good salvage." The gangers tensed. Weapons shifted in my direction. I had just pointed out that they had overlooked valuable loot, which could be interpreted as criticism or helpful observation depending on how they chose to take it. The woman laughed. It was not a pleasant sound, but it wasn't entirely hostile either. "Smart meat," she said, gesturing to one of the others. "Vex, grab the arm. Kid's right." The ganger she'd called Vex moved back to the corpse and began the process of detaching the augmetic limb with practiced efficiency. He was older than the others, his exposed arms covered in scar tissue that formed deliberate patterns. Ritual scarification that told stories I didn't yet know how to read. The woman approached me, her boots leaving bloody footprints on the deck plating. Up close, I could see that her armor was painted in rust-red patterns that might have been decorative or might have been old blood. The mask she wore was fashioned from some kind of treated fungus leather, hard as plasteel but organic, breathing slightly with each exhalation. "What's your designation, meat?" Kale Torrens, Unit K7743, Fungus Farm Worker, Sector 12. "That your whole life? The farms?" "Since I was 7 standard." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected. "You know what you just did, Kale Torrens? You proved you can think. Most meat down here, They go through their whole lives without a single original thought. They follow the schedules, eat the paste, sleep in their holes, and die when their bodies give out. But you saw an opportunity, and you took it. You spoke up when every instinct should have told you to stay quiet. That takes either stupidity or potential. She paused, letting the implications hang in the air. The rust vipers are always looking for potential. You want to keep working the farms until your lungs give out at 30? Or you want to see what else the Underhive has to offer? I looked at the tech priest's corpse. At the water station now controlled by gang authority. At the corridor full of workers who had already adapted to the new reality. At my own green-stained hands that smelled of fungus rot and chemical waste. I thought about 11 more years of the farms, of watching my body break down, of being recycled into corpse starch for the next generation, of dying without ever having chosen a single thing about my existence. "I want to see," I said. The woman extended her hand. It was covered in scars and old chemical burns, the knuckles reinforced with subdermal implants that turned her fist into a weapon. Then welcome to the real level 1847, Kyle Torrens. The rust vipers just gave you a choice. Don't waste it. I took her hand. Her grip was like plasteel, crushing, testing, measuring my resolve. When she released me, I could see the approval in her eyes. "I'm Kane," she said. "Gang boss. You'll meet the others soon enough. But first, you need to understand something. You just volunteered for a different kind of life. It's shorter, meaner, and more violent than the farms. But it's yours. You'll make choices. You'll have brothers and sisters who'll die for you and expect you to die for them. You'll learn what it means to fight for every scrap of territory, every liter of water, every moment of existence. And when you die, not if, when, you'll die as something more than a statistic in the Administratum's population projections." She turned to address the rest of the gang, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "New meat. Potential recruit. Bring him to the den. Let's see if he survives initiation." 2 gangers moved to flank me, not hostile but watchful. Vex, still carrying the tech priest's severed augmetic arm, gave me a nod that might have been approval or might have been pity. As we moved away from the water reclamation station, leaving the corpse for the recycling servitors, I looked back one last time at the corridor where I had spent 19 years shuffling between the farms and my hab compartment. The workers had already returned to their routines, flowing around the crime scene like water around a stone. By tomorrow, someone else would be assigned my production quota. My sleeping alcove would be occupied by another body. The machine would continue without me, indifferent to whether I lived or died or transformed into something else entirely. I had lived my entire life beneath the sun and never seen it once. But I had just seen something else. Something that glinted in the darkness like a promise or a threat. I had seen choice. And once you've seen it, you can never go back to the comfortable blindness of predetermined existence. The rust vipers led me deeper into the Underhive, away from the familiar corridors and into territory I had only heard about in whispered warnings. The darkness grew thicker here, the bioluminescent fungus giving way to the harsh glare of makeshift electrical lights strung from corroded pipes. The walls were marked with gang sigils, territorial boundaries written in paint and blood. And somewhere in that darkness, I was about to learn what it meant to choose, to fight, to become something more than meat. I was 19 years old, and my life was finally beginning. Even if that beginning looked remarkably like an end. The rust viper's den was carved from what had once been a Prometheum storage facility, 3 levels down from the water reclamation station. The journey there took us through corridors I had never seen, past territories marked by gang sigils that shifted from crude paint to elaborate murals to burn. Scarred warnings. Each symbol told a story of violence, of boundaries defended with blood, of power structures that existed entirely outside the Administratum's awareness. Kane led us through a concealed entrance, a blast door camouflaged to look like a section of collapsed wall. Beyond it lay a network of chambers that had been transformed into something between a fortress and a home. The walls were reinforced with scavenged plasteel. Gun emplacements covered every approach. But there were also sleeping areas with actual mattresses instead of bare metal bunks, a communal eating space with real tables, and lighting that didn't have the sickly green tinge of fungus glow. It was still Underhive, still dark and close and smelling of recycled air, but it was theirs in a way that the Hab compartments could never be. 37 people called this place home. I counted them as we entered, a habit from the farms where you learned to track numbers because shortages meant someone wasn't getting their ration. They ranged from teenagers younger than me to scarred veterans who looked like they'd survived things that should have killed them. All wore the gang's colors, rust red and deep brown, the colors of dried blood and corroded metal. All carried weapons within easy reach, even while eating or sleeping or engaged in what passed for leisure. "Gather up," Kane called, her voice cutting through the ambient noise of conversation and weapon maintenance. New meat. Potential recruit. Names Cale Torrens, late of the Fungus Farms, demonstrated field awareness during the water station acquisition. The gang assembled with practiced efficiency, forming a loose semicircle around me. Their eyes measured me with the same cold assessment I'd seen Kane use earlier. Not hostile, exactly, but evaluating, calculating whether I represented an asset or a liability, whether I'd survive long enough to be worth the investment of training and trust. A woman stepped forward from the group, older than most, her left arm replaced from the elbow down with a crude but functional augmetic limb that looked like it had been scavenged from industrial equipment. Her face bore the ritual scars that marked senior gang members, 3 parallel lines running from temple to jaw on each side. Her eyes held the kind of tired wisdom that came from watching too many people die. "Lissa," she introduced herself, her augmetic hand extending in greeting. "Quartermaster." I manage supplies, territory resources, and new recruit evaluation. "You worked the Fungus Farms for how long?" 12 years, I replied, gripping her metal hand. It was warmer than I expected, maintained better than the crude augmetics I'd seen on factory workers. "Then you understand scarcity. You understand that nothing is free and everything has a cost." It wasn't a question. That's more than most recruits bring. Usually, we get meat fresh from the upper levels, dropped down here for some infraction, still thinking the world owes them something. She released my hand and circled me slowly, her eyes cataloging details. The green staining on my hands, the slight stoop in my posture from years of low ceilings, the way I tracked movement in my peripheral vision, a habit from working in the farms where the fungus sometimes grew fast enough to be dangerous. "He'll do," she said finally, addressing Kane. "He's already adapted to Underhive conditions. Won't need to break him of upper-level assumptions, just needs to learn the difference between surviving and fighting." "That's what initiation is for," Kane replied. She gestured to Vex, the scarred veteran who'd retrieved the tech priest's augmetic arm. "Vex, he's your responsibility. Standard protocol. If he survives, he's in. If he doesn't, well, we'll use the biomass." Vex nodded slowly, his face expressionless behind the network of ritual scars that covered every visible inch of skin. He was perhaps 40 standard years, ancient by Underhive reckoning, his body a map of violence survived. Burns, blade cuts, impact damage, radiation scarring. Each mark told a story, and collectively they formed a narrative of impossible endurance. "Come with me, kid," he said, his voice like gravel scraping against plasteel. You got questions. Now's the time to ask them. Once initiation starts, talking gets you killed. He led me to a smaller chamber off the main den, what might have once been a supervisor's office in the Prometheum facility's operational days. Now it served as an armory and training space, walls lined with weapons in various states of repair and maintenance. Another figure was already there, a young man perhaps a year or two younger than me, cleaning a stub gun with the careful concentration of someone still learning. "Tomas," Vex said. "New meat, like you. Name's Kyle. You two are going through initiation together, which means you watch each other's backs until one of you dies or both of you make it through." Tomas looked up, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized because I'd felt it myself not long ago. Hope. The dangerous kind of hope that still believed things could get better, that this was temporary, that somewhere above us there was a world that made sense. "Hey," he said, extending a hand that wasn't stained green or scarred by industrial work. "I'm from level 1200. Got dropped down here 3 weeks ago for asking the wrong questions to the wrong overseer. But I'm going to get back up there. Soon as I prove myself valuable enough, find a way to work off the infraction." Vex snorted, a sound without humor. "Kid still thinks the Imperium keeps score. Still thinks good behavior gets rewarded." He turned to me. "You that naive, Kale?" I thought about 19 years in the farms, about watching Essa get recycled while still breathing, about the tech priest's body being stripped for parts while his blood pooled on the deck. "No," I said simply. "Good. Means you might survive." Vex pulled 2 knives from a weapons rack, each one a brutal piece of work, industrial metal sharpened to a killing edge and wrapped in fungus leather for grip. He handed one to each of us. "Initiation has 3 parts: blood oath, scarification, and the proving. You fail any part, you're out. And out means dead. Because we can't have meat walking around knowing where our den is, knowing our numbers, knowing our defenses." He let that sink in, watching our faces for signs of panic or second thoughts. The blood oath is simple. You swear loyalty to the Rust Vipers above all other authorities, above the Administratum, above the Ecclesiarchy, above the God Emperor himself if it comes to it. This gang is your family, your law, your faith. You die for your brothers and sisters, and they die for you. You break this oath, you don't get a trial or hearing. You just disappear, and your body goes into the next corpse starch batch with a note attached explaining what happens to traitors. Tomas shifted uncomfortably. "Above the Emperor? That's heresy." Vex's smile was not kind. "Kid, you're already heretical just by existing down here. The Imperium doesn't want your loyalty. It wants your labor and your biomass. Down here, we're already outside the light of the Astronomicon, already beyond salvation. So we might as well be practical about it." He pulled out a battered data slate, its screen cracked but functional, displaying text in high Gothic that had been simplified for the barely literate. "Read it, understand it, then swear it, or walk away now and we'll make it quick." I read the oath. It was surprisingly straightforward, none of the flowery language of imperial devotional texts. Just simple statements of absolute loyalty, promises of mutual defense, acknowledgement that the gang's survival superseded individual life. It was, in its brutal honesty, more truthful than anything I'd heard from the Ecclesiarchy missionaries. "I swear it," I said. Vex turned to Thomas, who was still staring at the slate, his finger tracing the words as if looking for some loophole, some way to swear loyalty without actually committing heresy. He hesitated. "I swear it. But when I get back to level 1200, when I work off my infraction—" "If you make it through initiation, you're not going back," Vex interrupted. "That's the point. You're choosing this life. Choosing the gang over the Imperium's scraps. Once you swear, there's no going back to being meat in the machine." Tomas nodded, but I could see the hope still burning in his eyes. He thought this was temporary. Thought he could game the system, use the gang as a stepping stone to something better. I had seen that look before in the farms, on workers who still believed they could be promoted to easier jobs if they just worked hard enough. They were always the ones who broke first when reality refused to match their expectations. "Scarification comes next," Vex continued, pulling out a heated blade from a small brazier I hadn't noticed. The metal glowed, a dull red hot enough to cauterize as it cut. 3 marks to start, 1 for each oath you swore. Loyalty, protection, sacrifice. You take them on your face or your arms, your choice, but they have to be visible. Everyone needs to see you've committed. He demonstrated on his own arm, pointing to 3 parallel scars among the hundreds that covered his skin. These were my first. 32 years ago. Every scar after that tells a story. Battles survived, brothers lost, territory won and lost and won again. By the time you're my age, if you make it that long, your body will be a history book of the Hive wars. I rolled up my sleeve, exposing my forearm. The skin was already damaged from years of chemical exposure in the farms, mottled with discoloration and minor burns. 3 more scars would barely register. "Forearm," I said. Vex nodded approval. "Smart. Face scars mark you when you need to move through civilian territories. Arm scars you can hide if necessary." He positioned the heated blade. "This is going to hurt. Don't scream. Don't pull away. The pain is part of the oath. It reminds you that everything worth having costs something." The blade bit into my flesh with a sound like meat hitting a hot pan. The pain was immediate, absolute, a white-hot line of agony that ran from my wrist to my elbow. I smelled burning skin, my own flesh cooking under the heated metal. My teeth clenched hard enough to crack, and every muscle in my body locked rigid, but I didn't pull away, didn't scream. Just breathed through my nose in short, harsh bursts, while Vex carved 2 more parallel lines into my arm. When he pulled the blade away, my arm looked like it had been branded by industrial equipment. 3 raised welts, blackened at the edges, already beginning to weep clear fluid. The pain didn't fade, but settled into a deep, burning throb that pulsed with my heartbeat. "Good," Vex said simply. He turned to Thomas. "Your turn." Thomas chose his face. I saw the calculation in his eyes. If he was going back to level 100, he wanted to look like he'd suffered, like he'd paid his dues in the Underhive. He wanted the scars to be visible proof of his ordeal, not understanding that they would mark him forever as gang-touched, unemployable in any legitimate industry. He screamed when the blade touched his skin. Not a brief cry, but a full-throated wail that echoed through the chamber. Vex paused, blade still pressed to flesh. "I said don't scream!" "The pain is private. You share it with your brothers, not the whole Emperor-damned level." Tomas bit down on his own hand, blood welling between his teeth as the blade continued its work. By the time Vex finished, Thomas was shaking, tears streaming down his face to mix with the blood from his scarification and the wound in his hand where he'd bitten through his own palm. "You'll toughen up," Vex said, though his tone suggested he doubted it. "Or you'll die. Either way, the universe balances." He pulled out 2 strips of cloth, surprisingly clean, and showed us how to wrap our wounds. No medical attention, no antiseptic, no pain suppressors. Just cloth to keep the wounds from bleeding too much, and instructions to let them heal naturally. The scars would be more prominent that way, raised and obvious, impossible to miss. "Final part," Vex said, leading us back to the main chamber where the rest of the gang had assembled in a rough circle. "The proving. Every gang has their own version, but for the Rust Vipers, it's simple. You need to demonstrate you can kill for the family. He gestured to the center of the circle, where two figures knelt with hands bound behind their backs. Both wore the colors of a rival gang, purple and black, the marks of the Midnight Talons. Both had been beaten recently, their faces swollen and bloody, but their eyes still burned with defiance. Captured them during a territory dispute 2 days ago, Vex explained. Been interrogating them for information about Talon movements and supply routes. Now they've served their purpose. Your job is to execute them. 1 each. Quick or slow, your choice, but it has to be you who does it. Has to be your hands that take the life. Lissa stepped forward, offering me a stub gun. Blade or bullet, Kale? What's your preference? I looked at the gun, then at the knife still in my hand from the oath ceremony. The prisoners were already dead. That had been decided the moment they were captured. This wasn't murder exactly. It was just the final step in a process that had started days ago. The gangs had their own rules, their own justice system, and this was the sentence for being caught in rival territory. But knowing that intellectually didn't change the reality that I was being asked to kill someone who had done nothing to me personally, someone who was simply on the wrong side of an invisible line drawn in under Hive darkness. Does it matter? I asked. They're already beaten, already helpless. Vex shook his head. Kid, you're missing the point. This isn't about them. It's about you. Can you do what needs to be done? Can you make the hard choice? In the Underhive, mercy gets you killed. Hesitation gets your brothers killed. You need to prove you can act when action is required, even when every civilized instinct screams at you to stop. I looked at the prisoner in front of me. He was perhaps 30 years old, scarred and muscular, a veteran ganger who had probably killed plenty of people himself. His eyes met mine, and I saw no fear there. Just a resigned understanding of how this worked. He'd been on the other side of this scenario before. He knew the rules. Make it quick, he said, his voice steady despite the blood in his mouth. I gave your quartermaster everything I know, no reason to make it last. Quick. I could do quick. I raised the stub gun, pressed it to his forehead, and pulled the trigger before I could think about it any further. The sound was impossibly loud in the enclosed space. The body toppled backward, blood and brain matter spraying across the deck in a pattern that my farm-trained mind automatically calculated for biomass recovery potential. Then I realized what I'd just done, what I'd just thought, and my stomach lurched. I had just killed someone. Ended a life. Reduced a conscious human being to meat and recycling material. And my first thought had been about biomass recovery. The gang erupted in approval, voices shouting congratulations, hands slapping my shoulders. Kane nodded from her position at the edge of the circle, a slight smile visible behind her mask. Lissa marked something on a data slate, officially recording my initiation. But all I could focus on was the body at my feet and the terrible understanding that I had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Thomas was next. His prisoner was younger, probably not even 20, with fresh scarification marks that suggested he was a new initiate to the Midnight Talons. The kid was crying, snot and tears mixing with the blood from his beating, begging in a language I didn't recognize but whose meaning was universal. Thomas took the gun Lissa offered him. His hand shook so badly I thought he might drop it. He pointed it at the prisoner, then lowered it, then raised it again. I can't, he whispered. He's just a kid. He's younger than me. He probably didn't even choose this life, just got swept up. Everyone down here got swept up, Vex interrupted. That's not an excuse. That's just reality. You want to survive. You need to accept what that means. But he's not threatening us. He's not attacking. He's just a person. Thomas's voice broke. Please. There has to be another way. Make him swear loyalty, recruit him, anything but this. Kane stepped forward, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. There is no other way. You swear the oath or you don't. You prove yourself or you fail. Those are the only options. Tomas stood there, gun shaking in his hand, tears streaming down his scarified face. The prisoner had stopped begging, perhaps sensing that mercy might come from this hesitation. I can't, Tomas said finally, lowering the gun. I won't. I'm not a murderer. I'm not like you people. I'm going back to level 1200, and I'm going to report this to the Arbites and... Vex moved. One smooth motion, his blade appearing in his hand and disappearing again, and Tomas was falling. The wound in his throat sprayed blood in arterial pulses that painted the deck in spreading pools. He clutched at his neck with both hands, trying to hold back the flood, his eyes wide with betrayal and shock. No mercy, Vex said quietly, kneeling beside Tomas as the light faded from his eyes. Not for enemies, not for brothers who fail. That's the rule. You proved you couldn't kill, which means you couldn't be trusted to protect the family when it mattered. He stood, wiped his blade on Tomas's clothes, and turned to the prisoner who Tomas had refused to execute. Your turn to choose, Vex said. You swear the oath, take the scars, you can replace the meat we just lost. Or you refuse, and you join him in the recyclers. The young Midnight Talon didn't hesitate. I swear. Whatever you want, I'll do it. Just like that, the gang had gained a member and lost a recruit. The mathematics of Underhive survival, balanced with blood. Lissa directed servitors to collect both bodies, Tomas and the prisoner I'd killed. They would be processed separately. Thomas's body would go to the gang's private recycling contracts, his biomass converted to nutrition paste that would feed the rust vipers. A way of ensuring that even in death, he served the family he'd tried to betray. The Midnight Talon's body would be dumped in rival territory, a message about the cost of getting caught. I watched them drag Tomas away, his blood leaving a trail across the deck that other gangers simply stepped over. He'd been alive 5 minutes ago. Had hopes, dreams, plans to return to a better life. And now he was resources, nothing more. You did well, Lissa said, appearing beside me. Her augmetic hand rested briefly on my shoulder, the gesture surprisingly gentle. First kill is always hardest, but you pushed through, didn't freeze, didn't hesitate long enough to let doubt take root. I was thinking about biomass recovery, I admitted, the words tasting like poison. As soon as he fell, I calculated his recycling potential. Good instincts, she said, completely serious. That's the kind of practical thinking that keeps you alive down here. Resources are resources. Sentiment is a luxury we can't afford. She led me away from the execution circle, back toward the quieter sections of the den. We passed gang members engaged in various activities: weapon maintenance, equipment repair, territory mapping, medical treatment for the wounded. It was organized, in a way the administratum hab compartments never were. Everyone had a role, a purpose, a contribution to the family's survival. Let me explain how this works, Lissa said, pulling out a detailed map of the Underhive territories. The administratum thinks they control everything down here. They send their tax collectors, their census takers, their arbiters to maintain the Emperor's peace. But they're wrong. This is gang territory, has been for centuries. We're the real government. The map showed a patchwork of controlled zones, each marked with different gang colors and symbols. The Rust Vipers held a respectable section around the Prometheum storage and several water reclamation stations. The Midnight Talons controlled manufacturing sectors and fungus farms. A dozen other gangs divided the rest, their territories shifting constantly as wars were fought and treaties were made. Every gang follows the same basic structure, Lissa explained. Leadership, usually a boss and a council of veterans. Specialists like me who handle logistics, supplies, recruitment. Soldiers who enforce territory and fight the wars. And support personnel who maintain our equipment and facilities. We're more organized than most people realize. Have to be, or we'd collapse into chaos. Why doesn't the Imperium just wipe you out? I asked. Send in the guard, restore order? Lissa laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Because we serve a function they need. Think about it, Kale. Down here, there are billions of people. Literal billions. The Administratum can't possibly manage that many individuals. Can't track them, can't police them, can't even properly count them. So we do it for them. We impose order through territory control. We regulate population through controlled violence. We manage resource distribution through tribute systems. We're an unofficial part of the imperial structure, tolerated because we're useful. She pointed to areas on the map marked in red. These are dead zones. Territories so toxic or dangerous that even gangs won't claim them. This is where the Imperium draws the line. As long as we stay in our designated areas, as long as we don't interfere with critical infrastructure or try to move up Hive, they leave us alone. It's cheaper than maintaining a garrison down here. What happens if a gang gets too powerful, tries to expand beyond the Underhive? Arbite's orbital strike. Happened to the Iron Lords about 15 years ago. They controlled 40 sectors, had over 2,000 soldiers, were starting to demand representation in the planetary government. The arbitrators waited until their whole leadership was in one location, then dropped a bunker buster that vaporized 3 levels. Killed maybe 20,000 people, gang and civilians together. Message was clear. Stay in your place, or we'll delete you from existence. Vex joined us, his arms now washed clean of blood. Kid handled himself well. Better than most recruits. Better than Tomas. Tomas still thought the rules applied to him, Lissa observed. Still thought he could go back to his old life. You understand that's not an option anymore, right, Kyle? I thought about the tech priest's blood on the deck, about the gun heavy in my hand and the sound it made when I pulled the trigger, about Thomas bleeding out because he couldn't cross the line I'd crossed without hesitation. I understand, I said. I'm Rust Viper now. This is my family. Good, Kane said, appearing from wherever gang bosses materialized from, because tomorrow we're hitting a Midnight Talon supply cache in Sector 19. Revenge for some raids they've been running on our water stations. You'll be coming along, KL. Time to see what gang warfare really looks like. She handed me a flak vest, worn but functional, and a better stub gun than the one I'd used for the execution. Welcome to the family. Now let's see if you survive your first week. That night, I lay in my new sleeping area. An actual cot with a thin mattress, luxury compared to the hab compartment, and stared at my scarified arm. The wounds were still weeping, the pain a constant throb that kept me from sleep. Around me, other gang members snored or whispered in the darkness, the sounds of a community rather than a processing center. I had killed someone today, had watched another die for refusing to kill, had sworn oaths that made me a heretic in the eyes of the Imperium, had joined a family that measured loyalty in blood and survival in bodies. My hands still smelled faintly of gun oil and copper. The green staining from the farms was already beginning to fade, replaced by new marks, new scars, new purposes. I had lived 19 years as Unit K7743. A statistic in the Administratum's population projections. Now, I was Kale Torrens of the Rust Vipers, a name with weight, a person with purpose. The cost of that transformation was a body on the deck and the knowledge that mercy was a luxury I could never again afford. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new violence, new choices, new deaths. This was my life now. The family I had chosen. Or rather, the family that had chosen me when I demonstrated I could think, could adapt, could kill when necessary. In the darkness, I heard Vex's voice from across the chamber, addressing no one in particular. "First kill stays with you forever, kid. Gets easier after that. Not better. Just easier." I didn't respond. Just lay there with my burning arm and my racing thoughts, while somewhere above us, 50 levels up, workers were settling into their sleeping alcoves in hab compartments, eating their corpse starch, grinding through their shifts. I had been one of them yesterday. Today, I was something else. Tomorrow, I would learn exactly what that meant. 3 months in the rust vipers, and my hands had forgotten what softness felt like. The green staining from the fungus farms had faded completely, replaced by calluses that formed in layers like geological strata. Each ridge told a story. The thick pads on my palms from gripping weapons for hours during territory watches. The hardened knuckles from close quarters fighting when ammunition ran scarce. The rough patches on my fingertips from assembling and disassembling firearms until I could do it in complete darkness by touch alone. My hands had become tools, specialized instruments designed for violence and survival, their sensitivity sacrificed for durability. I noticed it first when handling the corpse starch rations. The paste came in sealed containers stamped with the Administratum's Aquila and a date of processing. I couldn't feel the temperature anymore, couldn't tell if it was warm or cold until I tasted it. The nerve endings in my fingers had been damaged by constant exposure to weapon lubricants, chemical solvents, and the peculiar mixture of promethium residue and industrial cleanser we used to maintain our equipment. Lissa said it was normal, that veteran gangers lost sensation in their extremities after a few years. Vex showed me his hands, the skin so thick and scarred that he could press them against hot metal without flinching. "Feeling things is a liability," he explained during one of our equipment maintenance sessions. "Pain distracts you. Discomfort slows you down. Better to go numb, let your body become the machine it needs to be." But the numbness wasn't just physical. I was learning to stop feeling things in other ways too. The first midnight Talon raid had been chaos, a running firefight through corridors so narrow we fought almost at arm's length. I'd killed 3 people that day, though I couldn't remember their faces, just the mechanical sequence of target acquisition, aim, fire, confirm the fall, move to the next threat. Afterward, Kane had praised my performance. I'd emptied 2 magazines with acceptable accuracy and hadn't frozen when a Talon fighter got close enough to grapple. I'd switched to my knife and opened his throat with the same motion Vex had demonstrated during training. I'd expected to feel something afterward. Horror, maybe. Guilt. The weight of having ended 3 human lives. Instead, I felt tired and hungry, my body demanding calories to replace the energy burned during combat. I ate my ration without thinking about it, cleaned my weapons, and slept dreamlessly for 6 hours before the next watch rotation. The second raid was easier. The 5th, easier still. By the 10th, I had stopped counting. The smell of the underhive had become a language I could read fluently. Every gang had their signature stench, a combination of the territories they controlled and the substances they used. The rust vipers smelled of promethium and gun oil, our den's industrial origins leaving traces in everything we touched. The midnight Talons carried the sharp chemical odor of the narcotic labs they operated in Sector 23, a Swedish rot that clung to their clothing and skin. The Ash Kings reeked of burnt flesh and ozone from the crematorium complexes they'd claimed, while the sump dwellers practically dripped with the sewage treatment territories that made them wealthy in water rights, but pariahs in close quarters. I learned to identify approaching gangers before I saw them, my nose picking up the territorial signatures from 50 meters away. It was a survival skill, essential in the narrow corridors where visibility was measured in arm lengths and ambushes could come from any shadow. More than once, that early warning saved my life, alerting me to hostile presence in time to take cover or call for backup. But there were smells beyond the gang territories. Deeper scents that rose from the levels below carried on ventilation currents that connected the entire hive in a network of atmospheric exchange. The smell of rot, yes, but not the simple decay of corpses awaiting processing. Something more fundamental, more organic. The smell of mutation. Of flesh transforming into configurations that shouldn't exist. Of chemistry gone wrong in bodies exposed to radiation and toxic runoff for generations. We called them the changed. The administratum called them muties and authorized their extermination on site. The gangs called them resources. The first mutant hunt happened in my 4th week with the Rust Vipers. A request came through the informal communication network that connected the gangs. The sump dwellers needed muscle for a clearing operation in the deep sump, 5 levels below the lowest permanent habitation. They were expanding their territory into regions that had been abandoned decades ago, reclaiming water treatment facilities that could supplement their existing operations. But the deep sump wasn't empty. It was inhabited by populations that had adapted to conditions no baseline human could survive. Kane assigned a squad of 8, including me. Vex led the operation, his experience with deep sump conditions making him invaluable for this kind of work. We descended through maintenance tunnels and emergency access shafts, moving through regions where the bioluminescent fungus gave way to complete darkness, broken only by our electric torches. The smell hit us at level 1952, a thick, organic stench like fermentation and gangrene mixed together, so powerful it made my eyes water. I pulled my respirator tighter, but the filters weren't designed for this level of contamination. The air itself felt wrong, too thick, too warm, carrying moisture that condensed on every surface in oily droplets. Radiation runoff from the reactor cores above, Vex explained, his voice muffled by his respirator. Mixes with the chemical waste from the manufacturing sectors, creates a soup that's toxic to normal biology. But life adapts. Always does. Give it a few generations, and you get populations that can process things that would kill us in hours. We found the first changed in what had been a water purification chamber. They had repurposed it into a living space, building structures from scavenged materials and organic growth that might have been fungus or might have been something else. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds in the shadows beyond our torchlight. Their bodies showed the expected mutations, extra limbs, malformed bones, skin that had taken on textures and colors no human should possess. But they had built a community, had tools, weapons, organization. They were people, just people who had adapted to an environment that would kill baseline humans. The sump dweller who'd hired us didn't care. Clear them out, he ordered. Dead or scattered, doesn't matter. We need this facility operational by next week. It wasn't a battle. It was extermination. We had guns and training and respiratory protection. They had improvised weapons and bodies that were strong but slow, adapted for endurance rather than combat. We killed 47 of them in the initial assault, drove the rest deeper into the tunnels where they'd either die from our pursuit or survive to rebuild elsewhere. I killed 6 myself. Confirmed kills, bodies I saw fall and could account for afterward. They had names for each other, I realized, called out in languages that might have been debased, low Gothic, or might have been something that evolved independently. One of them, an older male with 3 arms and eyes that reflected our torchlight like an animal's, had been trying to protect a smaller figure behind him. A child, or what passed for a child among the changed. I shot them both because my orders were to clear the facility and partial compliance wasn't an option. Afterward, we helped the sump dwellers strip the chamber of anything useful. The Changed had accumulated surprising amounts of salvage metal components, functional equipment, even some tech that looked administratum issued but was decades old. We found food stores too, protein paste in containers marked with gang sigils from crews that had been exterminated years ago. The Changed had been scavenging our leavings, surviving in the gaps between gang territories, building lives in spaces we deemed too toxic to bother with. "They're just people," I said to Vex as we hauled salvage back to the surface. "Mutated, yeah, but they had families, community. They weren't attacking anyone." Vex shrugged, his movements mechanical and tired. "Kid, you're thinking about this wrong. Doesn't matter if they're people. Doesn't matter if they have families. What matters is the sump dwellers paid us to clear them out, and we need the ration credits. The Changed needed that water facility to survive, and the sump dwellers need it to expand their operations. Can't have both. Someone has to die so someone else can live. That's just the mathematics. The mathematics." I heard that phrase constantly now, a justification for every atrocity, every brutal decision, every choice that reduced human lives to numbers in an equation. X. Number of people. Y amount of resources. Z bodies that must be removed to balance the calculation. The gang territories could support approximately 50,000 people at subsistence level. The actual population was closer to 200,000. Therefore, 150,000 excess units needed to be removed through violence, disease, starvation, or some combination of all three. The gangs facilitated this process through territorial wars that killed thousands, through control of water and food that allowed them to regulate population density, through mutant hunts that cleared out populations that might otherwise compete for resources. We were not society's rejects operating outside the system. We were the system's pressure relief valve, performing population control that the administratum couldn't officially acknowledge but desperately needed. The corpse starch tasted different after the mutant hunt. I noticed it during the evening meal, sitting with the squad that had accompanied me to the deep sump. The usual gray paste with its metallic sweetness, but now I could detect subtle variations in flavor. A faint bitterness that suggested liver tissue. A peculiar smoothness that indicated adipose rendering. An almost pleasant sweetness that meant the corpses had been well fed before processing, their bodies carrying actual sugar content instead of just protein and trace minerals. "You're learning to taste the ingredients," Lissa observed. 3 months in the rust vipers, and my hands had forgotten what softness felt like. The green staining from the fungus farms had faded completely, replaced by calluses that formed in layers like geological strata. Each ridge told a story. The thick pads on my palms from gripping weapons for hours during territory watches. The hardened knuckles from close quarters fighting when ammunition ran scarce. The rough patches on my fingertips from assembling and disassembling firearms until I could do it in complete darkness by touch alone. My hands had become tools, specialized instruments designed for violence and survival, their sensitivity sacrificed for durability. I noticed it first when handling the corpse starch rations. The paste came in sealed containers stamped with the administratum's aquila and a date of processing. I couldn't feel the temperature anymore, couldn't tell if it was warm or cold until I tasted it. The nerve endings in my fingers had been damaged by constant exposure to weapon lubricants, chemical solvents, and the peculiar mixture of promethium residue and industrial cleanser we used to maintain our equipment. Lissa said it was normal, that veteran gangers lost sensation in their extremities after a few years. Vex showed me his hands, the skin so thick and scarred that he could press them against hot metal without flinching. "Feeling things is a liability," he explained during one of our equipment maintenance sessions. "Pain distracts you. Discomfort slows you down. Better to go numb, Let your body become the machine it needs to be. But the numbness wasn't just physical. I was learning to stop feeling things in other ways too. The first Midnight Talon raid had been chaos, a running firefight through corridors so narrow we fought almost at arm's length. I'd killed 3 people that day, though I couldn't remember their faces. Just the mechanical sequence of target acquisition, aim, fire, confirm the fall, move to the next threat. Afterward, Kane had praised my performance. I'd emptied 2 magazines with acceptable accuracy and hadn't frozen when a Talon fighter got close enough to grapple. I'd switched to my knife and opened his throat with the same motion Vex had demonstrated during training. I'd expected to feel something afterward. Horror, maybe. Guilt. The weight of having ended 3 human lives. Instead, I felt tired and hungry, my body demanding calories to replace the energy burned during combat. I ate my ration without thinking about it, cleaned my weapons, and slept dreamlessly for 6 hours before the next watch rotation. The second raid was easier. The 5th, easier still. By the 10th, I had stopped counting. The smell of the Underhive had become a language I could read fluently. Every gang had their signature stench, a combination of the territories they controlled and the substances they used. The Rust Vipers smelled of promethium and gun oil, our den's industrial origins leaving traces in everything we touched. The Midnight Talons carried the sharp chemical odor of the narcotic labs they operated in Sector 23, a Swedish rot that clung to their clothing and skin. The Ash Kings reeked of burnt flesh and ozone from the crematorium complexes they'd claimed, while the Sump Dwellers practically dripped with the sewage treatment territories that made them wealthy in water rights, but pariahs in close quarters. I learned to identify approaching gangers before I saw them, my nose picking up the territorial signatures from 50 meters away. It was a survival skill, essential in the narrow corridors where visibility was measured in arm lengths and ambushes could come from any shadow. More than once, that early warning saved my life, alerting me to hostile presence in time to take cover or call for backup. But there were smells beyond the gang territories. Deeper scents that rose from the levels below, carried on ventilation currents that connected the entire hive in a network of atmospheric exchange. The smell of rot, yes, but not the simple decay of corpses awaiting processing. Something more fundamental, more organic. The smell of mutation. Of flesh transforming into configurations that shouldn't exist. Of chemistry gone wrong in bodies exposed to radiation and toxic runoff for generations. We called them the Changed. The Administratum called them muties and authorized their extermination on site. The gangs called them resources. The first mutant hunt happened in my 4th week with the Rust Vipers. A request came through the informal communication network that connected the gangs. The Sump Dwellers needed muscle for a clearing operation in the deep sump, 5 levels below the lowest permanent habitation. They were expanding their territory into regions that had been abandoned decades ago, reclaiming water treatment facilities that could supplement their existing operations. But the deep sump wasn't empty. It was inhabited by populations that had adapted to conditions no baseline human could survive. Kane assigned a squad of 8, including me. Vex led the operation, his experience with deep sump conditions making him invaluable for this kind of work. We descended through maintenance tunnels and emergency access shafts, moving through regions where the bioluminescent fungus gave way to complete darkness, broken only by our electric torches. The smell hit us at level 1952, a thick, organic stench like fermentation and gangrene mixed together, so powerful it made my eyes water. I pulled my respirator tighter, but the filters weren't designed for this level of contamination. The air itself felt wrong, too thick, too warm, carrying moisture that condensed on every surface in oily droplets. Radiation runoff from the reactor cores above, Vex explained, his voice muffled by his respirator. mixes with the chemical waste from the manufacturing sectors, creates a soup that's toxic to normal biology. But life adapts. Always does. Give it a few generations, and you get populations that can process things that would kill us in hours. We found the first changed in what had been a water purification chamber. They had repurposed it into a living space, building structures from scavenged materials and organic growth that might have been fungus or might have been something else. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds in the shadows beyond our torchlight. Their bodies showed the expected mutations: extra limbs, malformed bones, skin that had taken on textures and colors no human should possess. But they had built a community, had tools, weapons, organization. They were people, just people who had adapted to an environment that would kill baseline humans. The sump dweller who'd hired us didn't care. "Clear them out," he ordered. "Dead or scattered, doesn't matter. We need this facility operational by next week." It wasn't a battle. It was extermination. We had guns and training and respiratory protection. They had improvised weapons and bodies that were strong but slow, adapted for endurance rather than combat. We killed 47 of them in the initial assault, drove the rest deeper into the tunnels where they'd either die from our pursuit or survive to rebuild elsewhere. I killed 6 myself. Confirmed kills, bodies I saw fall and could account for afterward. They had names for each other, I realized, called out in languages that might have been debased, low Gothic, or might have been something that evolved independently. One of them, an older male with 3 arms and eyes that reflected our torchlight like an animal's, had been trying to protect a smaller figure behind him. A child, or what passed for a child among the changed. I shot them both because my orders were to clear the facility, and partial compliance wasn't an option. Afterward, we helped the sump dwellers strip the chamber of anything useful. The changed had accumulated surprising amounts of salvage metal components, functional equipment, even some tech that looked administratum issued but was decades old. We found food stores too, protein paste in containers marked with gang sigils from crews that had been exterminated years ago. The changed had been scavenging our leavings, surviving in the gaps between gang territories, building lives in spaces we deemed too toxic to bother with. "They're just people," I said to Vex as we hauled salvage back to the surface. "Mutated, yeah, but they had families, community. They weren't attacking anyone." Vex shrugged, his movements mechanical and tired. "Kid, you're thinking about this wrong. Doesn't matter if they're people. Doesn't matter if they have families. What matters is the sump dwellers paid us to clear them out, and we need the ration credits. The changed needed that water facility to survive, and the sump dwellers need it to expand their operations. Can't have both. Someone has to die so someone else can live. That's just the mathematics. The mathematics." I heard that phrase constantly now, a justification for every atrocity, every brutal decision, every choice that reduced human lives to numbers in an equation. X, number of people, Y amount of resources, Z bodies that must be removed to balance the calculation. The gang territories could support approximately 50,000 people at subsistence level. The actual population was closer to 200,000. Therefore, 150,000 excess units needed to be removed through violence, disease, starvation, or some combination of all three. The gangs facilitated this process through territorial wars that killed thousands, through control of water and food that allowed them to regulate population density, through mutant hunts that cleared out populations that might otherwise compete for resources. We were not society's rejects operating outside the system. We were the system's pressure relief valve, performing population control that the administratum couldn't officially acknowledge but desperately needed. The corpse starch tasted different after the mutant hunt. I noticed it during the evening meal, sitting with the squad that had accompanied me to the deep sump. The usual gray paste with its metallic sweetness, but now I could detect subtle variations in flavor. A faint bitterness that suggested liver tissue. A peculiar smoothness that indicated adipose rendering. An almost pleasant sweetness that meant the corpses had been well fed before processing, their bodies carrying actual sugar content instead of just protein and trace minerals. "You're learning to taste the ingredients," Lissa observed, sitting down beside me with her own ration. "Good skill to develop. Helps you identify when the quality drops below acceptable levels or when the processors are cutting corners with contaminated biomass." I looked at the paste on my spoon, really examined it for the first time in months. This had been people, multiple people, their bodies rendered down to base nutrients and reformed into this convenient, shelf-stable protein source. Somewhere in this paste might be fragments of Tomas, or the midnight talon I'd executed during initiation, or any of the dozens of casualties from recent gang wars. The thought should have disgusted me, should have made me unable to eat. Instead, I took another spoonful and analyzed the texture. Smooth, well-processed, no bone fragments or gristle. Quality product from healthy stock. I prefer it when there's that sweet note, I admitted. The bitter batches are harder to swallow. Lissa smiled, her scarred face showing approval. "That's practical thinking. Sentiment doesn't fill your stomach. The dead are dead. Might as well make the most efficient use of their biomass. The Emperor himself sits on a throne fed by 1,000 souls daily. We're just following his example on a smaller scale." Was that true? Was the Golden Throne really sustained by human sacrifice? The ecclesiarchy taught that the Emperor's suffering sustained the Astronomicon, that his psychic might protected humanity from the horrors of the warp. They never mentioned the feeding mechanism, the logistics of how you kept a corpse god alive for 10,000 years. But down here, the official doctrine mattered less than the practical reality. Whether the Emperor fed on souls or not, we certainly fed on bodies. The entire Underhive economy was built on biomass recycling, on the understanding that death was not an end, but a transformation from one useful state to another. I finished my ration and went back for seconds, my body demanding more calories to replace what I'd burned during the hunt. The paste went down easily now, just fuel for the machine my body was becoming. 6 weeks after the deep sump operation, we hit a midnight talon supply cache in Sector 19. Intelligence from Lissa's network suggested they were stockpiling weapons and ammunition for a major offensive, planning to push into Rust Viper territory and claim our water reclamation stations. The solution was preemptive: strike. Raid the cache, steal what we could carry. The war started over water rights and ended with half the Underhive burning. The Ash Kings had formed an alliance with 3 smaller gangs, pooling their resources for a coordinated assault on the major water reclamation stations. Their strategy was sound control. The water control everything else. Force the established gangs like the Rust Vipers and Midnight Talons to either pay tribute or die of thirst. It should have worked. The mathematics favored them. Superior numbers and strategic positioning against our established but scattered defenses. What they hadn't accounted for was desperation. When you threaten a gang's water supply, you're not just attacking their resources, you're attacking their ability to exist. And desperate people don't surrender. They burn everything down rather than lose slowly. The Rust Vipers, Midnight Talons, and Sump Dwellers formed an emergency coalition, 3 rival gangs united by the immediate threat of extinction. We hit the Ash King simultaneously across 12 sectors, using tactics that were less strategic and more apocalyptic. Improvised explosives in water mains, promethium fires in recycling centers, deliberate breaches of chemical storage that turned entire corridors into toxic dead zones. We weren't trying to win territory. We were trying to make the cost of victory so catastrophic that the Ash Kings would collapse under the weight of their own ambitions. It worked. The alliance shattered after 4 days of sustained warfare. the smaller gangs breaking away when they realized they were being used as expendable shock troops. The Ash Kings retreated to their crematorium territories, diminished but not destroyed, and the Underhive was left with 16 sectors, rendered uninhabitable, 40,000 casualties, and a toxic cloud that would take months to dissipate. But the Rust Vipers had lost our primary den. A direct hit from an Ash King demolition team had collapsed 3 levels of the old Prometheum facility, burying half our supplies and a dozen of our people under tons of rockcrete and twisted metal. Kane made the decision immediately. We couldn't hold our remaining territories against opportunistic raids from other gangs who'd see our weakness as an opening. We needed to retreat, regroup, find new ground to claim. "We're going up," she announced, her voice carrying over the assembled survivors. 73. Rust Vipers remained from our pre-war strength of 96. We looked like refugees, covered in soot and blood and chemical residue, carrying whatever weapons and supplies we'd managed to salvage. The mid-levels. Sector 47, around level 1400. Less gang presence, more civilian population, easier to establish control before anyone realizes what we're doing. Vex objected immediately. "That's close to enforcer jurisdiction. We start operating that high, we risk official attention." "We risk dying if we stay here," Kane countered. "The lower territories are compromised. The water we fought for is contaminated. The air is toxic. We go up or we scatter, and scattered gangs don't survive." The vote was brief, unanimous. We would ascend. I had never been above level 1847. None of us had, except for Kane and a few of the senior members who'd worked higher sectors before infractions or gang wars had driven them down. The journey upward should have been simple. Just follow the maintenance shafts and emergency access corridors that connected every level of the Hive. But simplicity assumed the route was clear, that the passages weren't controlled by other gangs, or blocked by structural failures, or monitored by automated security systems. We moved in combat formation, weapons ready, Vex leading the advance squad while Lissa managed our logistics train. The first few levels were familiar territory, deep Underhive regions we'd raided or traded with. Level 1846 was controlled by the Sump Dwellers, who let us pass in recognition of our recent alliance. Level 1843 was a dead zone, the air so thick with chemical particulate that we had to don respirators and move quickly before the filters clogged. Level 1840 was disputed territory, a no-man's land where we encountered scattered resistance from scavengers and mutant populations, small skirmishes that cost us ammunition, but no casualties. Then we hit level 1800, and everything changed. The air was different here. Cleaner, or at least less aggressively toxic. The bioluminescent fungus had been supplemented with actual electrical lighting, dim and flickering, but functional. The corridors were wider, the ceilings higher, designed for populations that weren't quite so desperately compressed. And there were people. Not gang fighters or factory workers, but something in between. Small merchants operating from improvised stalls. Repair technicians maintaining equipment that actually functioned. Even a few enforcers in official uniforms, though they wore gang colors underneath their authority, suggesting they'd been bribed or incorporated into the local power structures. "This is habitation zone territory," Vex explained as we moved through a crowded market corridor. "Not quite legitimate, but not completely lawless either. The Administratum maintains minimal presence here, collects taxes, enforces basic regulations, keeps the infrastructure functional. The gangs operate more carefully, less open violence, more protection rackets and tribute systems." I watched the people moving through the market, and they looked different from the workers in the deep Underhive. Better fed, cleaner, their clothing showing less wear. They had possessions beyond the bare necessities, decorative items, personal effects, small luxuries that would have been impossible to maintain in the levels below. Children played in side corridors, Actual children engaging in play rather than being pressed into labor as soon as they could walk. They don't know, I said, the realization hitting me with physical force. These people have no idea what it's like 50 levels down. Lissa nodded, her expression unreadable. Why would they? The hive is structured so each level only sees the level immediately above and below. Down here, they think they're at the bottom. Think they have it worst. They've never seen the deep underhive, never experienced the real grinding poverty. To them, this is hell. To us, this looks like luxury. We passed a food vendor, and the smell hit me like a weapon. Real protein, actual cooked meat instead of corpse starch paste. My mouth watered involuntarily, my body responding to scents I hadn't experienced since childhood. The vendor was selling grilled rat on a stick, the rodents bred in controlled farms rather than hunted wild. It was the cheapest food available in the market, the kind of meal that locals probably considered barely adequate. It looked like a feast to me. "Keep moving," Kane ordered, noticing several rust vipers slowing to stare at the market stalls. "We're not here to shop. We're here to find territory and establish control before the local gangs realize we're not just passing through." We ascended higher. Level 1750. Level 1700. Level 1650. Each level brought incremental improvements in living conditions, small changes that accumulated into vast differences. More lighting, better air quality, wider corridors, actual maintenance of infrastructure rather than just jury-rigged repairs, and fewer people, or at least less density, populations that weren't quite so desperately compressed into insufficient space. At level 1600, we encountered our first serious resistance. A local gang called the Steel Jackals controlled the sector we were trying to pass through, and they took exception to a heavily armed group moving through their territory without paying tribute. The confrontation was brief and brutal. We had superior firepower and combat experience. They had local knowledge and defensive positions. The firefight lasted maybe 10 minutes before their boss called for negotiation. Kane met with him in a neutral corridor, while the rest of us held position, weapons ready in case the negotiation turned violent. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see the body language. The Jackal boss was posturing, trying to project strength despite having just lost 5 fighters. Kane was calm, explaining our situation and our intentions with the matter-of-fact directness of someone who didn't have time for elaborate threats. They reached an agreement. We could pass through Jackal territory and establish ourselves in the unclaimed sectors around level 1400, but we owed them tribute for the passage and a mutual defense pact against any attempts by the lower gangs to follow our route upward. The cost was steep, half our remaining ammunition, and a commitment to support the Jackals if they came under attack from rivals. But it got us where we needed to go. Level 1400 was different from anything I'd experienced. The corridors were actually clean, maintained by servitors that performed regular cleaning cycles. The air carried scents I couldn't identify, something floral and artificial that Lissa said was scent dispersal from the upper levels, luxury fragrances that trickled down through the ventilation systems. And there were windows, actual transparent sections of wall that looked out onto the hive's interior, revealing the vast vertical expanse of Hive Primus. I stood at one of those windows for the first time and felt my sense of scale shatter. The hive stretched upward beyond sight, level after level rising into distant heights where the darkness gave way to actual light. I could see the glow of it, far above, a radiance that might have been artificial lighting, or might have been actual sunlight filtering down through the upper levels. The vertical distance was impossible to process. I'd known intellectually that the hive had nearly 2,000 levels, but seeing it was different from knowing it. The sheer scope of construction, the engineering required to maintain such a structure, the billions of souls it contained. It was beyond human comprehension. And below us, in the depths we'd just ascended from, were levels that existed in complete darkness. Levels I'd never seen. Levels below even the deep underhive where we'd hunted, mutants, regions so toxic and so deadly that they'd been abandoned entirely, left to their own evolutionary pressures, while the hive continued to build upward. "It's beautiful, in a way," Senna said, joining me at the window. "Horrifying, but beautiful. All of humanity's ambition and desperation pressed together into one vertical city. We're like insects in a hive, each of us thinking we understand the colony when we've only ever seen our own tunnel." We established our new den in an abandoned manufacturing complex on level 1387. The facility had once produced small components for larger industrial processes, but it had been shut down decades ago when production was consolidated to more efficient locations. The machinery was still present, but non-functional, massive presses and assembly lines that had calcified into industrial sculptures. We cleared out the debris, established defensive positions, and began the process of claiming the surrounding territories. The local population was different from the deep underhive workers I'd known. They had jobs. Actual employment with the administratum or private corporations, not just labor assignments. They lived in family units in hab blocks that had dedicated space for recreation and community. They even had access to education, limited but functional, teaching basic literacy and technical skills to children who might someday advance to higher positions. But they were terrified of us. The locals saw gangers as something from the nightmare levels below, violent primitives who'd somehow climbed up from the darkness. They paid tribute without resistance, crossing the street to avoid our patrols, teaching their children to recognize our colors and stay away. It took me 3 weeks to understand why their fear felt wrong. We had climbed 50 levels, ascending from the depths to what the locals considered barely civilized territory. And we were the monsters they warned their children about. But we'd come from conditions they couldn't imagine, survived in darkness they'd never experienced, adapted to scarcity that would have killed them in days. We were the foundation they lived on without knowing it existed. The revelation came at level 1200. Kane sent a squad to scout higher territories, looking for trade opportunities and potential expansion routes. I was part of the team, along with Vex, Lissa, and 4 others. We ascended through increasingly civilized levels, moving carefully to avoid enforcer patrols and using forged credentials Lissa had acquired to pass through security checkpoints. Level 1200 was the dividing line between the underhive and the midhive proper. It was the lowest level where the Adeptus Arbites maintained permanent stations, where the administratum's authority was absolute rather than negotiated through gang intermediaries. It was also the level where the hive's structure began to reveal its true purpose. The floor was grated metal in the commercial districts, transparent sections that allowed maintenance access to the infrastructure below. And through those grates, for the first time in my life, I could see upward with clear line of sight. I could see them. The wealthy, the merchants, and minor nobility and administrative functionaries who comprised the hive's middle class. They walked on streets 5 levels above us, moving between buildings that gleamed with actual cleanliness. They wore clothing that wasn't just functional, but decorative, colors that served no purpose except aesthetic pleasure. They aided public dining facilities, where servitors presented food on actual plates, meals that were prepared fresh, rather than dispensed from feeding stations, and they had no idea we existed. I stood there, looking up through the grated floor at people walking overhead, and I understood. Not intellectually. I'd always known that the hive had wealthy levels, that somewhere above us lived people who experienced comfort and security. But knowing and seeing were different things. A woman walked directly over my position, her shoes clicking on the metal grate perhaps 6 meters above my head. She was laughing at something her companion had said. her voice carrying down through the environmental acoustic design. She wore a dress that cost more than my life, fabric that shimmered with embedded circuitry producing decorative light patterns. She was perhaps 30 years old, healthy and well-fed, and completely unburdened by any awareness of the billions of souls living below her in darkness. "First time seeing them?" Lissa asked quietly, standing beside me. I don't know what I thought. That they knew. That they chose to ignore us. But they don't know, do they? They have no idea that 50 levels down, people are eating corpse starch and fighting gang wars over water rights. "Why would they know?" Lissa replied. "Information flows upward in the hive, never down. They see the level above them, aspire to climb higher, but they never look down. Can't afford to. Because if they did, if they really understood how the hive works, they'd have to confront their complicity. Easier to remain ignorant." Vex joined us, his scarred face showing something that might have been amusement or might have been disgust. "See the architecture? The way it's designed? This graded floor isn't for maintenance access. It's a barrier. Keeps the classes separated while allowing resources to flow down. Light, heat, waste, everything trickles through the system from top to bottom. The rich benefit from proximity to the spire's resources. The poor down below process the waste and provide the labor that keeps everything running. It's not an accident. It's engineered." We moved through the commercial district using our forged credentials and Lissa's knowledge of local customs to blend in with the merchant class. No one looked at us directly. In the mid-hive, gang colors were forbidden, so we wore civilian clothing that Lissa had acquired specifically for this purpose. We looked like lower-level workers, perhaps maintenance technicians or factory supervisors, people too far down the social hierarchy to warrant attention from the truly wealthy but high enough to move through public spaces without suspicion. The market district sold things I'd never imagined existed. Fresh fruit imported from agri-worlds, luxury items that served no functional purpose, entertainment devices, books, musical instruments. There was a vendor selling scented oils, tiny bottles of liquid that cost more than a month's ration credits in the underhive. The scents were supposed to promote relaxation and well-being, a solution to stress that consisted of smelling pleasant things rather than addressing the underlying causes of anxiety. People complained about their lives here. I heard it in passing conversations, locals grumbling about work conditions or housing quality or the behavior of their social superiors. They thought they had it hard, thought they were suffering. They had no framework to understand that their worst day was better than our best day, that their poverty was our impossible luxury. "We could take this," Senna said, her voice low but intense. "We have weapons, combat experience, numbers. We could sweep through this level, kill the enforcers, claim the resources for ourselves. Finally get what we deserve." "And then what?" Lissa asked. "Even if we succeeded, even if we killed every Arbeitsan enforcer on this level, what happens next? The upper levels send in the real military. The PDF, maybe the Guard if it's serious enough. They orbital strike the entire sector, kill everyone, gang and civilian together, then rebuild with a new population. You think this is the first time underhive gangs have tried to rise? The system has protocols for this. We're allowed to exist down there, in the darkness, as long as we stay in our place. But the moment we try to climb, we get exterminated." Vex led us to a viewing platform, a public observation deck that looked out across the hive's interior toward the spire tops. From here, we could see the true scale of the structure. The lower hive where we'd come from was just the foundation, the massive base that supported everything above. The mid-hive where we stood was the industrial engine, hundreds of levels of factories and processing plants and logistics centers. And above that, rising toward the sky, were the spire tops, where the true nobility lived. The spire tops glowed with light. Not the sickly green of fungus or the harsh glare of industrial lighting, but warm, golden radiance that suggested actual sunlight or perfect artificial simulation. I could see gardens up there, green spaces visible through transparent sections of wall, trees growing in the sky as impossible and beautiful as anything I'd ever imagined. "That's where the planetary governor lives," Vex said, pointing to the tallest spire. "The noble houses, the ecclesiarchy leadership, the administratum high command, people who've never been below level 500, who think the mid-hive is inhabited by primitives and the underhive is just a myth, a horror story to scare children. They believe they earned their position through merit, through genetic superiority, through the Emperor's will. They have no idea. Their entire civilization rests on the backs of people they've never seen." I watched the spires, trying to comprehend the distance between my starting point on level 1847 and those gleaming towers, nearly 2,000 levels of separation. A vertical distance that represented the entire scope of human social hierarchy compressed into physical space. And suddenly, I understood the system, really understood it, not just the mechanics but the purpose. The hive was not designed for efficiency or comfort or even survival. It was designed for stratification, for maintaining absolute separation between the classes while extracting maximum value from each level. The underhive provided labor and biomass. The lower mid-hive processed resources and manufactured goods. The upper mid-hive managed logistics and administration. The spire tops consumed the products of all that labor while contributing nothing except governance and control. And each level believed they understood the system while remaining completely ignorant of the levels below. "We can't fight this," I said, the words tasting like defeat. "Can we? We can't break upward, can't challenge the hierarchy, can't do anything except survive in the spaces they've designated for us." "Now you're learning," Vex replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "The upper hive doesn't need us to die, KL. They need us to live down there, suffering just enough to keep quiet, breeding the next generation to replace us when we break down. We're the foundation they built their sky on. And foundations don't rebel. They just bear the weight until they crumble, then get replaced with new material." Lissa pulled out a data slate, showing us schematics of the hive structure. Every level produces approximately 10% more value than it consumes. That surplus flows upward through tribute, taxation, and resource extraction. By the time it reaches the spire tops, the compounded surplus from 2,000 levels of extraction represents unimaginable wealth. The planetary governor lives in luxury built on 10,000 tiny increments of suffering, each one too small to trigger rebellion, but collectively capable of sustaining an aristocracy. "And if we try to disrupt that flow?" Senna asked. "We get classified as a threat to imperial interests and eliminated," Lissa replied. "There are protocols. The Arbites maintain kill teams specifically for gang suppression. The PDF has entire regiments designated for hive pacification. And if it gets really bad, orbital bombardment, they'll kill millions to protect the system, sacrifice entire levels to maintain the hierarchy." We stood there in silence, watching the spires gleam in the distance. Around us, mid-hive citizens went about their lives, completely unaware that their prosperity was built on invisible suffering. They saw the poor below them and felt superior, saw the wealthy above them and felt envious. But they never asked what supported their position, never wondered what existed in the darkness beneath their feet. "So what do we do?" I asked finally. "Just accept it? Go back down to level 1387 and play our role in the system?" Vex turned to me, his scarred face showing something that might have been pity or might have been approval. "We survive, kid. We take care of our family, control what territory we can, live as well as the system allows. Some of us get a few decades of it. Most don't. But we don't waste those years fighting battles. We can't win against an enemy that doesn't even know we exist. That's it? That's your wisdom? Survive and accept? That's all there is, Vex replied. You want to rage against the system. Go ahead. Won't change anything. The Hive was built this way 10,000 years ago, and it'll be built this way 10,000 years from now. We're just temporary occupants of spaces that existed before us and will exist after us. Our individual suffering doesn't matter to the machine. Our individual choices don't affect the outcome. We're statistical noise in an equation that's already balanced. I looked up at the spires one last time, memorizing the sight. The golden light, the green gardens, the promise of a world where people lived without grinding poverty or constant violence. It existed. It was real. But it might as well have been on another planet for all the chance I had of reaching it. We descended back to level 1387, moving through the familiar territories with new understanding. The people at level 1400 who'd seemed so comfortable, so blessed with luxury. They were suffering too, just in ways I hadn't been able to recognize. The workers at level 1600 who'd looked well-fed and clean, they were exploited labor, just slightly higher on the extraction hierarchy. Everyone I'd seen during the ascent was trapped in the same system, aware only of their immediate circumstances, blind to the vast machinery that processed their lives into surplus value for the levels above. And somewhere below us, on level 1847 and deeper, people were grinding through shifts in the fungus farms, eating corpse starch, sleeping in overcrowded hab compartments. They thought they had it worst, thought they were at the bottom of the hierarchy. They had no idea about the levels below them, the deep underhive where mutants hunted in toxic darkness, the abandoned zones where humanity had devolved into something else entirely. Each level thought they saw the whole system while remaining blind to 90% of its structure. That night, back in our new den, Kane gathered the gang for a briefing. We'd established territorial control, set up tribute systems with local businesses, and begun recruiting from the local population. The Rust Vipers were adapting to mid-hive life, learning to operate with less overt violence and more sophisticated extortion. We climbed 50 levels, Kane said, her voice carrying pride and exhaustion in equal measure. We survived a war, evacuated our territory, fought our way up, and established new ground. Most gangs that lose their primary den just scatter and die. We didn't. We adapted. That's what makes us Rust Vipers. The gang cheered, celebrating our survival. But I couldn't join them. All I could think about was the woman in the shimmering dress, walking overhead without awareness, the vendor selling scented oils as a solution to stress, the gardens growing in the spire tops, 2,000 levels above the darkness where I'd been born. We had climbed 50 levels, ascending from impossible poverty to slightly less impossible poverty, and we'd discovered that the distance to actual prosperity was so vast, so absolutely insurmountable, that even seeing it felt like a cosmic joke. Lissa sat down beside me, her automatic hand resting on my shoulder. "You're thinking about the spires." "I'm thinking about the whole structure, how perfect it is, how efficiently it extracts suffering and converts it to luxury. How everyone is trapped in their little section, thinking they understand the system while remaining completely ignorant." "Welcome to enlightenment," she said with dark humor. "Most people never see beyond their immediate level. You've seen the depths and the heights. You understand how the machine works. Question is, what do you do with that knowledge?" Vex says, "Survive. Accept that we can't change anything." Vex is probably right, Lissa admitted. But there's another option. Use the knowledge. The system is vast and complex systems have exploitable spaces. We can't break the hierarchy. but we can operate in its gaps, carve out small spaces of autonomy, protect our family and maybe a few others. It's not revolution, but it's not complete submission either. I looked around at the gang, my family. 73 people who'd survived hell together, who'd killed and bled and climbed together, who deserved something better than serving as the foundation for someone else's sky. Then that's what we do, I said. We survive, we protect our own, and we make sure that every level we take from the system is one less level supporting the structure above. Lissa smiled. Now you're thinking like a real Underhive lifer. Welcome to the war that never ends, fought by people the enemy doesn't know exist, for stakes too small to matter in the grand calculation. But they mattered to us. That was enough. It had to be enough. Because the alternative was accepting that our suffering was meaningless, our lives were meaningless, our entire existence was nothing but statistical noise in a machine that didn't care if we lived or died. And I wasn't ready to accept that. Not yet. Maybe never. 2 years in the Rust Vipers, and I stopped counting days. Time had lost its meaning. Somewhere in the endless cycle of patrols and raids, negotiations and executions, the grinding routine of territorial control that defined gang life in the mid-Underhive, I no longer marked anniversaries or celebrated the passage of standard years. The only calendar that mattered was the rhythm of tribute collections, the seasonal patterns of gang conflicts, the predictable cycles of violence that structured our existence as reliably as any administratum work schedule. I was 21 years old, though the number felt arbitrary. Age was measured differently down here, not in years, but in scars, in operations survived, in the slow accumulation of experience that transformed raw recruits into hardened veterans. I had 43 scars now, each one telling a story. Blade wounds from close quarters fighting, lace burns from firefights in narrow corridors, chemical scarring from exposure to toxic runoff during deep-level operations, and the ritual marks, parallel lines carved into my flesh to commemorate significant events in the gang's history. My body was becoming a history book, a physical record of the Rust Vipers' struggles and victories. When I looked in the reflective surfaces of polished metal, I barely recognized the person staring back. The green-stained hands from the fungus farms were gone, replaced by calloused weapons, grip, and chemical burns. The slight stoop from years of low ceilings had been corrected by combat training that demanded perfect posture for optimal firing positions. Even my face had changed. The soft features of youth hardened into angular planes marked by a blade scar that ran from temple to jaw. A gift from a Midnight Talon fighter who'd gotten closer than he should have before Senna put him down. I was not Kale Torrens anymore, not Unit K7743 from the fungus farms. I was Rust Viper, Enforcer, Lissa's designated successor for quartermaster duties. My name had become secondary to my function, a label that mattered less than the role I performed within the family structure. The realization came gradually, not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow dissolution of the person I'd been. It started with small things, forgetting my birth date, losing track of which hab compartment I'd lived in before joining the gang, struggling to remember the faces of people I'd worked alongside in the farms, their features blurred by distance and irrelevance. Then came the bigger dissolutions. The understanding that I would never leave the Underhive, never see the sun, never experience life outside the gang structure. That this existence, patrols and violence, tribute collection and territory defense, the endless grinding struggle for resources, was not temporary, was not a stepping stone to something better, was simply reality, the only reality I would ever know. The mourning period for that lost future lasted perhaps a week. Then, it was replaced by something else. Not acceptance exactly, but a reframing. If this was my life, if there was no escape from the Underhive's crushing gravity, then I needed to find meaning within the system rather than searching for meaning outside it. The gang became my entire world, not because I was forced to stay, but because everywhere else had ceased to matter. Lissa taught me the quartermaster duties with the systematic precision she applied to everything. Resource allocation, tribute calculations, supply chain management, recruitment evaluation. The logistics that kept 73 people fed, armed, and functional required constant attention and mathematical precision. Every decision was a calculation. How many ration credits to spend on ammunition versus medical supplies, which tribute payments to enforce strictly versus which ones to relax to maintain civilian cooperation, when to invest in new equipment versus when to save resources for emergency situations. "You're good at this," she said during one of our inventory sessions, her automatic hand moving across the data slate with mechanical efficiency. "Better than me, actually. You see the patterns faster, make connections I miss. You've got the mind for systems thinking." "Learned it in the farms," I replied, cataloging ammunition stores and noting which calibers were running low. Had to track fungus growth rates, chemical inputs, biomass outputs. Same principles, different application. "It's more than that," Lissa insisted. "You understand that resources are people and people are resources. Most quartermasters either treat everything as cold numbers or get too sentimental about individual cases. You balance both. Calculate the mathematics, but remember that the numbers represent lives." I looked up from the inventory, meeting her eyes. "Does that make me good at the job or just good at lying to myself?" She smiled, the expression carrying something that might have been pride or might have been sadness. "Both. The best quartermasters are the ones who can hold two contradictory truths simultaneously. People matter. People are expendable. Both statements are true, and you need to believe both to do the job correctly." The gang had changed in the 2 years since our ascent to level 138.7. We'd grown from 73 survivors to 94 members, absorbing smaller gangs and recruiting from the local population. Our territory had expanded to include 12 sectors, each one contributing tribute that funded our operations and enriched our collective resources. We'd established trade relationships with other gangs, formal treaties that regulated conflict and created mutual defense pacts against external threats. We were becoming an institution, a permanent fixture of the mid-Underhive's power structure. And with that permanence came ritual, tradition, the ceremonial aspects that transformed random violence into something with meaning and structure. The combat rituals were elaborate, almost religious in their precision. Before major operations, we gathered in the den's central chamber for the Oath of Brothers, each member speaking their commitment to the family and their willingness to die for the collective good. The words varied, but the sentiment remained constant. We fight together, we die together, and our deaths serve purposes larger than individual survival. Then came the marking, where Cain would use a heated blade to add new scarification to the warriors participating in the operation. Temporary marks that would fade if you survived, permanent ones if you fell in battle. Your body became a record of service, a physical manifestation of commitment to the gang's purposes. Finally, the remembrance, where we spoke the names of fallen members and recounted their deeds, not mournful or sad, but celebratory. Recognizing that death was not failure, but completion, the natural endpoint of a life lived in service to the family. Each name was followed by the gang's response. "They served. They fell. They are remembered." I found myself looking forward to these rituals, the structured formality that gave shape to violence that might otherwise feel random and meaningless. The oath reminded me why I fought. The marking connected me to the gang's history. The remembrance assured me that my own eventual death would not be anonymous, would not disappear into the administratum's statistical noise, but would be preserved in the collective memory of people who mattered. There was beauty in it, dark beauty, horror transformed into meaning through ritual and repetition, but beauty nonetheless. The honor codes had similar effects. We had rules, unwritten but absolute, that governed gang behavior. You never abandoned a wounded brother. You never betrayed operational information under torture. You never claimed credit for another's kill or territory. You never showed mercy to proven enemies, but you never killed without reason. You never wasted resources, but you never let family go hungry. These codes were enforced with brutal efficiency. Violations meant death, usually execution by the gang boss in front of the assembled family. But enforcement was rare because the codes made sense, provided structure in an environment that might otherwise collapse into complete chaos. They were the difference between organized violence and random murder, between a functional community and a death cult. I learned to love the codes, not despite their brutality, but because of it. They demanded excellence, sacrifice, absolute commitment. They elevated gang membership above mere survival into something approaching purpose. The midnight talons hit us on a cold morning in the month of Septus, 6 months after we'd established ourselves at level 138.7. They'd been planning it for weeks, maybe months, assembling forces from allied gangs and coordinating their assault for maximum damage. 50 fighters, heavily armed, striking simultaneously at 3 of our key positions: the primary den, our largest tribute collection point, and Lissa's supply depot. The attack was sophisticated, professional, suggesting they'd received intelligence about our operations from somewhere inside our network. They knew exactly where to hit, exactly when our patrols rotated, exactly which positions were most vulnerable. The fighting was brutal and immediate. I was at the supply depot with Lissa when they hit, a dozen Talon fighters breaching our defenses with demolition charges and sustained fire. We fell back to secondary positions, returning fire while calling for reinforcements, fighting room to room through the depot's storage chambers. Lissa was magnificent in combat. Her augmetic arm provided strength beyond baseline human capability, allowing her to handle heavy weapons with single-handed ease. She'd positioned herself at a choke point, holding off 5 attackers while I evacuated critical supplies to secure locations. Her stub cannon roared in regular rhythm, each shot precisely aimed, each target falling with mechanical efficiency. Then I heard the sound that every ganger dreads. The distinctive hiss of a crack grenade's fuse, followed by the metallic clink of it bouncing across the floor toward Lissa's position. "Down!" I screamed, but she'd already seen it. Already calculated that there was no time to escape the blast radius. Her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, I saw her decision. She threw herself on the grenade. The explosion was muffled by her body, the force directed downward and outward instead of up toward the ceiling where it might have caused structural collapse. The blast killed her instantly, her augmetic arm torn free and launched across the chamber, her organic components reduced to shrapnel and mist. But her sacrifice saved the depot. Saved me. Saved the supplies that would keep the gang operational through the coming siege. I don't remember the rest of the fight clearly. Just fragments, moving through smoke and chemical haze, firing until my weapons ran dry, using Lissa's severed augmetic arm as a club when ammunition ran out, the strange crystalline clarity that comes from absolute rage channeled into focused violence. When reinforcements arrived, we'd held the depot. 6 Talons dead, the rest retreating under covering fire, and Lissa's body, or what remained of it, cooling on the deck where she'd made her final stand. Kane arrived to assess the damage, her expression unreadable behind her candid mask. She looked at Lissa's remains, at the preserved supplies, at me covered in blood and chemical residue with an augmetic arm still clutched in my hand. "She chose well," Kane said simply. "The supplies are worth more than any single life." She understood that, made the calculation, and acted without hesitation. "She was your friend," I said, the words coming out flat and distant. "More than that, she was family." "Which is exactly why she did it," Kane replied. "Because family means sacrifice, means making the hard choice so others don't have to. She died protecting the gang's resources, which means she died protecting all of us." The funeral ritual happened that night. We gathered in the den's central chamber, all 94 members of the Rust Vipers, and spoke Lyssa's name in the remembrance. Kane recounted her history. 23 years in the gang, starting as a factory worker who'd killed her abusive supervisor and fled to the Underhive. She'd risen through merit and capability, become quartermaster through demonstrated excellence in logistics and planning. She'd survived 17 major operations, killed 38 confirmed enemies, and recruited 47 members who still served. But more than the numbers, Kane spoke about Lyssa's character. Her augmetic arm, which she'd maintained with obsessive precision, keeping it functional long after most gang equipment would have failed. Her dry humor during inventory sessions. Her patience training new recruits. Her absolute commitment to the gang's success, demonstrated finally by using her own body as a shield to protect supplies. Then came the preservation. Lyssa had designated me as her successor months ago, a contingency plan she'd implemented with characteristic thoroughness. As her chosen heir, I inherited her territory, her responsibilities, and her scarification marks. Vex performed the ritual, using Lyssa's own heated blade recovered from her personal effects to carve her distinctive scars into my flesh. 3 parallel lines on each side of my face, temple to jaw, the senior marks that designated quartermaster status. The pain was absolute, transforming my face into a mask of ritual scarring that would mark me permanently as Lyssa's successor. But I didn't flinch, didn't cry out, just breathed through the agony while Vex worked, understanding that this pain connected me to Lyssa's legacy, to the 24 quartermasters who'd served before her, to a tradition that stretched back decades through the gang's history. When it was done, when my face was carved with her marks, Kane spoke the formal words. Lyssa served. Lyssa fell. Lyssa is remembered. Her knowledge lives in her successor. Her territory persists in our control. Her name enters legend. And the gang responded. They served. They fell. They are remembered. I became the gang's quartermaster that night, inheriting not just responsibilities, but identity. I was no longer just Kyle, individual person with individual history. I was quartermaster, role and function, the latest in a lineage of people who'd held this position and made the same calculations, the same sacrifices, the same commitment to the gang's survival above personal survival. The days after Lyssa's death brought clarity I hadn't experienced before. I threw myself into the quartermaster duties with obsessive focus, managing every detail of resource allocation and supply chain logistics. But I also began to understand the larger context, the scope of what we were part of. The Rust Vipers controlled 12 sectors, but those sectors produced resources that fed the entire Hive's economy. The tribute we collected from local businesses wasn't just wealth extraction. It was a tax on productivity that flowed upward through the system. The protection we provided to manufacturing facilities ensured their continued operation, which ensured the production of components that would eventually be assembled into weapons, vehicles, starship parts. Everything we did, every territory we controlled, every business we protected or extorted, fed into the vast industrial machine that sustained the Imperium's war efforts. The bullets that guard regiments fired on distant worlds started as raw ore mined in the deep underhive, processed in mid-level manufactorums, distributed through gang-controlled supply chains, and finally shipped upward to the spire-level depots. We were not separate from the Imperium. We were its foundation, the invisible infrastructure that made everything else possible. I started documenting this understanding in my quartermaster logs, tracking not just our immediate resources but the flow of goods through the territory we controlled. Water from reclamation stations became coolant for industrial processes. Corpse starch from recycling centers became protein supplements for factory workers. Scavenged components from gang raids became replacement parts for critical machinery. Every resource had a chain of provenance, a history of violence and exploitation that culminated in its current use. And every chain originated in darkness, in the grinding poverty and desperate struggle of people who would never see the benefits of their labor. "You're thinking too much," Vex said one evening, finding me in the quartermaster's office surrounded by data slates and resource projections. "The calculations making you philosophical?" "The opposite," I replied. "The philosophy is making me better at calculations. Once you understand that we're part of the system rather than outside it, the numbers make more sense. We're not stealing resources, we're managing them. Not controlling territory for our benefit, but maintaining the infrastructure that keeps the Hive functional." Vex settled into a chair, his scarred face showing approval. "Took me 15 years to understand that. You got there in 2. That's why Lissa chose you as successor. She saw that you could hold the big picture and the immediate details simultaneously." "Does it matter?" I asked. "Understanding the system, seeing our place in it, does it change anything?" "Changes everything," Vex said. "Once you understand that you're necessary, that you serve a function the Imperium desperately needs, even if they'll never acknowledge it, you stop being a victim. Stop seeing yourself as trapped by circumstances. You become a component performing essential work. There's pride in that. Purpose." I thought about Lissa throwing herself on the grenade, about the 47 people she'd recruited who still served, about the supply chains she'd established that kept flowing even after her death. Her life had mattered, not because she'd escaped the underhive or risen above her circumstances, but because she'd performed her role with excellence and passed that knowledge to someone who could continue it. "We die in darkness so others can wage war in the light," I said, the words crystallizing a thought I'd been forming for months. "The Emperor doesn't know our names, but his wars are built on our bones." "Exactly," Vex confirmed. "We're the invisible, the forgotten, the statistical noise in the Administratum's population projections. But we're also the foundation. Every bullet fired in the Emperor's name, every ship that launches from the spire tops, every scrap of processed ore that feeds the war machine. All of it starts here, in the darkness, with people like us managing the flow of resources through violence and tribute." He pulled out a bottle of second-rate Amasec, something we'd confiscated from a tribute payment. Poured 2 measures into improvised cups. "To Lissa," he said, raising his cup. "Who understood that dying well was more important than living long?" "To Lissa," I echoed and drank. The Amasec burned going down, harsh and unrefined, but real. Not recycled, not synthetic, but actual distilled alcohol from grains grown on some distant agri-world. Someone had farmed those grains. Someone had processed them. Someone had distilled and bottled the result. And through a chain of tribute and trade that passed through a dozen gangs and 100 middlemen, it had ended up here, in the underhive, being consumed by people the farmers would never meet. Everything was connected. Every action rippled outward through systems so complex that no individual could track all the consequences. The Midnight Talons sued for peace after 3 weeks of sustained conflict. The initial assault had been their opening move in what they'd planned as a quick territorial grab. Instead, they'd triggered a grinding siege that cost both sides resources neither could afford to lose. We negotiated through neutral intermediaries, eventually reaching an agreement that restored pre-war boundaries and established new tribute arrangements that compensated both sides for their losses. The war had killed 37 people, 19 Rust Vipers, 18 Midnight Talons. Each death represented skills lost, training wasted, potential eliminated. From a pure resource perspective, the war had been catastrophically inefficient. Both gangs were weaker than before, our territories less secure, our membership depleted. But from another perspective, the war had served its purpose. It had reminded other gangs that the Rust Vipers would defend their territory with absolute commitment. It had tested our newer members under combat conditions, identifying who could be trusted in crisis situations. It had created bonds between survivors, the shared trauma of battle forging stronger connections than years of peaceful coexistence could achieve. And it had given meaning to Lissa's death, transforming her sacrifice from random tragedy into purposeful action that had preserved the gang's critical resources during a moment of maximum vulnerability. I entered her name in the gang's chronicle, the handwritten record that Kame maintained in her personal quarters. Lissa Corvain, Quartermaster, 23 years of service, killed in action defending Supply Depot against Midnight Talon assault. Her entry joined hundreds of others, names and deeds stretching back through decades of gang history. She would be remembered. Not by the Imperium, not by the Administratum's official records, but by the family she'd served and died protecting. Her knowledge lived on in me, her chosen successor. Her scarification marks had been transferred to my face, making me a physical continuation of her legacy. Her strategies and systems remained in place, still guiding the gang's resource management. She had achieved a form of immortality, not the grand, legendary status of imperial heroes, but something smaller and more intimate. She would live as long as the Rust Vipers existed, her name spoken during the remembrance, her deeds recounted to new recruits, her example inspiring future generations. That night, alone in the quartermaster's office, I looked at my reflection in a polished metal surface. My face was a map of ritual scarring now. The 3 lines from initiation, the newer marks from significant operations, and Lissa's distinctive temple-to-jaw scars that designated my position. I barely resembled the person who'd worked the fungus farms 2 years ago. Kale Torrens had died somewhere during the ascent from level 1847, had dissolved gradually into Rust Viper, into Quartermaster, into a function and role rather than an individual person. And I was content with that dissolution, more than content. I embraced it, because individual identity was a burden, a weight of personal history and individual desires that complicated the clarity of purpose. As Quartermaster, I knew exactly what I needed to do: serve the gang, manage resources, train my eventual successor, die well when my time came, ensuring that my knowledge and position passed to someone capable of continuing the work. There was peace in that certainty, beauty in the structured clarity of purpose, meaning in the understanding that my life, however brief and brutal, contributed to something larger than individual survival. The gang was eternal. Individual members were temporary, but the knowledge passed from one generation to the next, the traditions maintained through ritual and scarification, the purpose preserved through shared commitment. That was as close to immortality as anyone in the Underhive would ever achieve. I pulled out Lissa's data slates, beginning the process of integrating her records with my own. Years of careful documentation, resource tracking, strategic planning. All of it now mine to maintain and expand. "I'll serve well," I said to her memory, to the empty office, to the scarification marks that burned on my face. I'll preserve what you built and pass it to someone worthy. That's the promise. That's the purpose. Outside, the gang continued its eternal routine. Patrols rotating through territory, tribute collectors moving between businesses, training sessions preparing new recruits for violence, the machine grinding forward, processing human lives into security and resources and meaning. And somewhere far above, in the spire tops, people walked in gardens and sunlight, completely unaware that their existence rested on foundations of darkness and blood, and the invisible labor of people whose names they would never know. We were the forgotten. We were the foundation. We were the price of the Imperium's glory. And we paid it willingly because the alternative was meaninglessness, and meaning, even dark meaning purchased with suffering, was worth any cost. Lissa had understood that, had proven it with her final action. Now it was my turn to carry that understanding forward, to serve with the same excellence and commitment, to eventually make the same sacrifice when circumstances demanded it. The wheel would turn. The system would persist, and the rust vipers would endure, generation after generation, each one serving and falling and being remembered by the family they died protecting. That was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all we would ever have. 5 years in the rust vipers, and Vex died the way he'd always said he would, standing between the gang and annihilation. It happened during the Sump Wars, when the lower gangs finally organized a coordinated assault on the mid-level territories. They came up from the depths like a tide, thousands of fighters from a dozen gangs, united by desperation and the mathematical certainty that they would die if they stayed below. The toxic zones were expanding, chemical runoff from the manufacturing sectors, poisoning entire levels, forcing populations upward or into extinction. The rust vipers held Sector 47's primary choke point, a narrow corridor complex that connected the lower access shafts to the mid-level hab. Zones. If it fell, the entire defensive line would collapse, and 50,000 refugees would flood into territories that couldn't support them. The mathematics were brutal. Either we held, or the mid-levels descended into chaos that would require Arbite's intervention and orbital strikes to restore order. Vex led the defense with 70 years of experience, compressed into tactical decisions made in seconds. He positioned our heavy weapons for optimal crossfire, coordinated with allied gangs to create layered fallback positions, rotated fighters to prevent exhaustion while maintaining continuous fire. For 3 days and nights, he held that corridor against waves of attackers who threw themselves at our positions with the desperate courage of people who had nothing left to lose. On the 4th day, they brought up a heavy industrial mining laser, the kind used to cut through solid rockcrete in tunnel expansion operations. Vex saw it coming, understood immediately that our fortifications couldn't withstand sustained fire from equipment designed to carve through the Hive's structural foundations. He could have ordered a retreat, should have, by any tactical assessment. We had secondary positions prepared, fallback routes planned. We would have lost the corridor, but saved our people, lived to fight again from more defensible ground. Instead, he charged. Alone, carrying nothing but his knife and a lifetime of accumulated rage at a system that ground people into components and called it necessity. He crossed 100 meters of open corridor under sustained fire, his body absorbing impacts that should have killed him, but somehow didn't, momentum and fury carrying him forward until he reached the mining laser's position. I watched through the scope of my rifle as he killed the weapon crew. 6 fighters, trained and equipped, dying to a 70-year-old man who moved like murder, given physical form. Then he turned the laser on the advancing forces, sweeping it across their formations in wide arcs that turned human beings into component atoms and superheated plasma. The assault broke. The lower gangs scattered, their coordination shattered by the sudden reversal, their momentum lost to the primal fear of facing a weapon that could erase you from existence without even leaving a corpse to recycle. Vex held that position for another 2 minutes, giving us time to reinforce, to establish new firing positions, to salvage victory from what should have been collapse. Then the mining laser overheated from sustained use beyond its operational parameters, and the power cell detonated. The explosion vaporized everything within a 20-meter radius. Vex disappeared in a flash of white light, his final act creating a crater that would later become a permanent monument, a scar in the Hive structure that would remain long after everyone who remembered him was dead. We held the corridor. The Sump Wars ended with negotiated territorial adjustments that created buffer zones and new resource-sharing agreements. The refugees were absorbed gradually, integrated into existing populations through carefully managed distribution that prevented the catastrophic overcrowding everyone had feared. And I inherited Vex's position as the gang's senior tactical advisor, the voice of experience that guided strategy and training. At 24 standard years, I was the youngest person ever to hold the role. But I carried Lys's knowledge as quartermaster and Vex's tactical wisdom transferred through years of training and observation. I was ready, had to be ready. The gang didn't pause for grief or allow time for inadequacy. The day after Vex's death, Kane promoted me in front of the assembled family. "Vex served!" Vex fell. "Vex is remembered," she intoned, her voice carrying the weight of ritual. "His knowledge lives in his successor. His tactical doctrine persists in our operations. His name enters legend. They served. They fell. They are remembered," the gang responded. Then she turned to me, her mask removed for the first time I'd ever seen, revealing a face covered in so many ritual scars that her original features were almost unrecognizable. She was perhaps 50 years old, ancient by Underhive standards, her body held together by augmetics and stubborn refusal to die. "You hold 2 positions now," she said. Quartermaster and tactical advisor. Lys's logistics and Vex's warfare, this has never been done before in the gang's history. The knowledge you carry makes you invaluable, which also makes you a priority target for any enemy who understands our structure. You will be careful. You will train multiple successors for both positions, and you will serve until the gang no longer needs you or until circumstances require your sacrifice. "I understand," I replied. "I'll serve." "I know you will," Kane said, and there was something in her expression that might have been pride or might have been pity. "That's why I'm about to make your life infinitely more complicated." She handed me a data slate containing the gang's complete strategic archives. Decades of accumulated knowledge, every major operation, every territorial negotiation, every alliance and betrayal. Information that represented the Rust Viper's institutional memory, the collective wisdom that allowed us to survive when other gangs collapsed. "This is what we are," she said. "Everything we've learned, everything we've paid for in blood and bodies. You're now responsible for preserving it and adding to it. When I fall, not if, when, you'll inherit the gang. You're 24. If you're competent and lucky, you might make it to 30 before something kills you. That gives you 6 years to prepare someone else to carry this forward. Don't waste them." The weight of that data slate felt heavier than any weapon I'd ever carried. This was the gang's soul, compressed into digital format and entrusted to my preservation. "I won't," I promised. That night, I read through the archives, absorbing history I'd never known. The Rust Vipers had been founded 83 years ago by a woman named Cora Viper, a factory worker who'd killed her overseer and fled to the deep Underhive with 17 followers. They'd claimed territory through violence and maintained it through the same principles we still followed. absolute loyalty, calculated ruthlessness, and the understanding that individual survival mattered less than collective endurance. Cora had served for 23 years before dying in a territorial war with a gang whose name no longer existed. Her successor had served for 11 years. The next, for 7. The pattern continued, each gang boss serving until death or incapacitation, each one adding their knowledge to the archives and passing it forward to the next generation. I was reading the history of a family that had persisted through 8 decades of gang wars, hive politics, and the grinding attrition of under-hive existence. We had outlasted dozens of rival gangs, survived catastrophes that killed thousands, adapted to changing conditions, and evolved our tactics while maintaining core principles. We were an institution, a tradition, a living organism that transcended individual lives and continued through the preservation and transmission of accumulated knowledge. And I was now responsible for its continuation. The new recruits arrived 3 weeks after Vex's death. 18 of them, refugees from the lower levels where the toxic zones had made continued habitation impossible. They were young, desperate, and completely unprepared for what gang life actually meant. They thought joining the Rust Vipers would be an escape from grinding poverty, an upgrade from the hell they'd experienced below. They had no idea they were just trading one form of suffering for another. I recognized the look in their eyes because I'd seen it in the mirror 5 years ago. Hope, the dangerous kind of hope that still believed in better futures and second chances. The kind of hope that would get them killed within weeks if we didn't break it carefully and replace it with something more sustainable. Training fell to me now, Vex's role absorbed into my expanding responsibilities. I gathered the recruits in the den's training chamber and looked at their expectant faces, seeing myself at 19, fresh from the fungus farms, thinking the gang was a path to freedom rather than just a different kind of cage. "You're here because you think you have no other options," I began, my voice carrying the authority of position and experience. "You're partially right. The levels below are dying. You stay there. You die with them. But don't mistake necessity for opportunity. The Rust Vipers aren't salvation. We're just a different way to suffer." They shifted uncomfortably, their hope already beginning to crack under the weight of reality. "Some of you will die during initiation," I continued. The blood oath, the scarification, the proving. They're not symbolic. They're tests designed to identify who can function under the conditions we face daily. Last initiation cycle, we started with 23 recruits. 11 made it through. The other 12 are recycling material now. One of them raised a hand, a young woman with burn scars covering half her face. "What if we refuse? What if we decide this isn't for us?" "Then you leave," I said simply. "We don't force anyone to join, but you leave with nothing. No supplies, no protection, no knowledge of our operations. You go back to the toxic zones or try your luck with another gang or find some third option I haven't thought of. The choice is yours. It's always yours. That's the gift we offer. Choice. The cost is responsibility for that choice." I watched them process this information, seeing their illusions crumble in real time. Good. Broken illusions meant clearer thinking, better judgment, higher survival rates. "The Rust Vipers endure because we understand what we are," I continued. "We're not rebels fighting the system. We're not criminals operating outside the law. We're infrastructure. We regulate population density through violence. We manage resource distribution through tribute. We maintain order in spaces where official authority is too expensive to project. We serve the same function as the administratum or the Arbites, just without the official recognition or resources." The burned woman spoke again. "So we're slaves? Just better armed slaves?" "We're components," I corrected. "Organic machinery performing essential functions. but we're components with dignity, with purpose, with family. We choose how we serve and who we serve it with. That's more freedom than most people in this hive will ever know. I thought about Lissa throwing herself on the grenade, about Vex charging into certain death to buy us seconds we needed, about Cain leading for decades, absorbing trauma and responsibility that would have broken most people within years. The gang offers you 3 things, I said. Purpose. You'll know why you fight and who you fight for. Family. You'll have brothers and sisters who'll die for you and expect you to die for them. And meaning. When you fall, and you will fall, your death will matter. You'll be remembered. Your name will enter the chronicles. Your knowledge will pass to your successor. You won't disappear into statistical noise like the billions of anonymous dead who built this hive. I paused, letting the words sink in. That's the offer. Purpose, family, meaning. The cost is everything else. Your individual ambitions, your hopes for escape, your dreams of better futures. You give that up and embrace what is rather than mourning what could have been. If you can make that trade, you'll survive. If you can't, you'll die badly. The initiation began the next day. The blood oath came first, each recruit swearing absolute loyalty to the gang above all other authorities and allegiances. Several hesitated at the heretical implications, the explicit rejection of the emperor's primacy. I explained patiently that we were already heretical, simply by existing in the underhive. That official doctrine condemned us regardless of what oaths we swore. That practical survival required acknowledging reality over comfortable lies. 16 of them swore. 2 refused and were escorted out of gang territory with minimal supplies and directions to neutral zones. I didn't expect them to survive the week. The scarification followed, Cain performing the ritual with the same heated blade she'd used on hundreds of initiates. 3 parallel lines carved into flesh, marking commitment with permanent scars. Some screamed. Some bit through their own flesh to avoid screaming. All bled, their blood mixing on the chamber floor in a collective pool that would be preserved as part of the gang's ritual materials. One recruit, a young man perhaps 17 years old, asked why we used pain as part of the initiation instead of some less traumatic ceremony. Because pain is honest, I replied. It can't be faked or ignored or dismissed. When you look at your scars, you'll remember what you endured to earn them. Remember that membership costs something real, not just words and promises. The scars connect you to everyone who came before, everyone who bore the same marks and made the same choice. The proving was last, and it was where most failures occurred. Each recruit had to demonstrate they could kill for the family, could execute an enemy without hesitation or mercy. We'd captured 3 fighters from a failed raid on our territory, members of a minor gang that had thought our recent losses made us vulnerable. They were wrong. We'd crushed the raid easily, killing most of the attackers and capturing the survivors for exactly this purpose. 14 recruits faced 3 prisoners. The mathematics were deliberately unbalanced. Not everyone would get a clean execution, which meant some would have to participate in group violence, which meant confronting the reality that killing wasn't always clinical and distant. 12 succeeded. 2 refused, unable to cross that final threshold from civilian to soldier, from person who recognized the sanctity of life to component who understood that life was just another resource to be managed. We executed the refusers alongside the prisoners. Quick deaths, bullets to the head, their bodies processed for biomass alongside the enemies they'd refused to kill. Harsh, but necessary. We couldn't have people in the gang who might hesitate during combat, whose moral objections might get their brothers killed. The 12 survivors became Rust Vipers that night, officially marked in the gang's chronicles and assigned to various roles based on their demonstrated capabilities. I looked at their scarified faces and saw myself 5 years ago, fresh from initiation, still processing what I'd become. The wheel turned. The system continued. And the gang endured, generation after generation, each one serving and falling and passing their knowledge forward. I was 24 years old, and I understood with absolute clarity that I would never leave the Underhive, would never see the sun, or experience the gardens in the spire tops, or escape the grinding cycle of violence and poverty. This was my life, from initiation to death, however many years or months that span encompassed. But I also understood something else, something that had taken 5 years and countless deaths to crystallize into certainty. This was not failure. This was not victimhood. This was not meaningless suffering in service to an indifferent machine. This was the foundation. We were the foundation. Every bullet fired in the Emperor's name, every ship launched from the spire tops, every gram of processed ore that fed the Imperium's war machine. All of it originated here, in the darkness, refined through violence and distributed through networks we maintained with our blood. The Imperium stood on our backs. The golden throne, the gleaming spires, the noble houses with their gardens and art and comfortable delusions. All of it rested on the invisible labor of people like us, people who would never be acknowledged, never be thanked, never be anything more than statistical noise in the Administratum's population calculations. But we were necessary, essential. The system could not function without us performing roles we'd never been asked to perform, had never been officially assigned, but which were absolutely critical to the machine's continued operation. We regulated chaos through violence, distributed resources through tribute, maintained order through fear and loyalty, and the structured rituals that gave meaning to horror. We were the immune system, the pressure relief valve, the foundation that bore weight without complaint because someone had to bear it. And in bearing that weight together, we had found something the upper hive would never know. We had found family, not the bloodline families of the nobility, or the sanctioned breeding populations of the Administratum, but chosen family. Brothers and sisters bound by shared suffering and mutual sacrifice, connected by rituals that acknowledged our common humanity even as we performed inhuman acts. I had seen faces illuminated by burning corpses during the Sump Wars, fighters standing back to back against impossible odds, dying for each other with the casual certainty of people who knew their deaths would be remembered and honored. I had felt the weight of Lys's augmetic arm in my hand after she died protecting supplies, had watched Vex disappear in white light, his final act ensuring that the family would survive, even though he wouldn't. This was what it meant to be human, not the comfortable abstractions of imperial theology or the sanitized narratives of official history, but this standing in darkness with people you trusted absolutely, fighting for purposes larger than individual survival, finding meaning in solidarity and shared purpose. The Underhive was not a failure of the system. It was the system, functioning exactly as designed. A space where excess population was processed through violence and deprivation, where resources were extracted with brutal efficiency, where human beings were converted into labor and biomass and the minimal order necessary to prevent complete collapse. But within that designed horror, we had carved out spaces of meaning. We had created families, traditions, rituals that acknowledged our worth even when the official structure denied it. We had found honor in serving functions no one wanted to acknowledge, dignity in enduring what the comfortable couldn't imagine. The peace I felt wasn't the absence of suffering. It was the acceptance of suffering's purpose, the understanding that our pain purchased something real. The continuation of civilization, the functioning of the Imperium, the survival of humanity across a hostile galaxy. We were the price of mankind's persistence, The cost paid in darkness so that others could live in light. And we paid it willingly, because the alternative was meaninglessness, and we had learned to create meaning from the raw materials of horror and violence and shared suffering. I looked down at the new recruits, young and scarred and still processing what they'd become. They thought they understood now, thought the initiation had revealed the full truth. But they had years of learning ahead, layers of understanding that only accumulated through experience and survival. Some would die quickly. Some would live long enough to train their own successors. All would serve, and all would fall, and all would be remembered by the family they died protecting. The wheel would turn, the system would persist, and the rust vipers would endure, generation after generation, bearing witness to the truth the comfortable would never acknowledge. That their prosperity was built on our bones, their gardens watered with our blood, their peace purchased with our endless war. Kane found me in the training chamber after the recruits had dispersed, her masked face revealing nothing but her posture suggesting something important.
"There's a boy watching the den,"
she said. Civilian, looks maybe 19, 20 standard, been out there for 3 days, observing our patrols, studying our movements. Same pattern you followed before Lissa recruited you. I felt something shift in my chest. Recognition. The wheel turning again. You want me to approach him? You're the one who trains them now, Kane said. Seems appropriate that you'd be the one who brings in the next generation. Just like Lissa brought you in. Just like someone brought her in before that. The pattern continues. I found him in a corridor adjacent to our territory, pressed against a wall in shadow, watching a rust viper patrol with the intense focus of someone trying to understand a complex system. He was thin, malnourished, his hands stained green from fungus work. He looked exactly like I had 5 years ago, desperate, observant, and unconsciously calculating whether the gang offered better survival odds than the alternatives. I approached openly, weapons visible but not threatening. He tensed but didn't flee, which suggested either courage or exhaustion. "You've been watching us," I said. It wasn't a question. "Just curious," he replied, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trying not to provoke violence. "Wondering how the territories work, how gangs maintain control." "You're lying," I said without hostility. "You're evaluating, deciding whether to approach us or find another gang or try to survive without affiliation. You've been working the fungus farms, level 1800, maybe 1850, and you've realized that there's no future there. You'll work until your body breaks, get recycled into corpse starch, and disappear without anyone remembering your name. You want something more? Something that matters." His eyes widened slightly, surprised at the accuracy of my assessment. "How did you—" "Because I was you," I interrupted. 5 years ago. Same calculation, same desperation, same hunger for something beyond grinding existence. I joined the Rust Vipers. Vipers. Lost my individual identity, my hopes for escape, my illusions about justice or fairness. But I gained purpose, family, and the certainty that when I die, it'll mean something. I pulled back my sleeve, showing him my scarified arm, then turned my head, letting him see the ritual marks covering my face. "This is what the gang costs. Everything you are gets burned away until only your function remains. You become a component in a machine, performing roles that are essential but never acknowledged. You'll kill people. You'll watch brothers die. You'll serve purposes that feel wrong until you understand the larger context." I paused, letting him process. "But you'll also have family. Real family, not just genetic coincidence, but chosen connection. You'll have purpose beyond production quotas. You'll have meaning when you fall. And you'll be part of something that's endured for 8 decades and will endure 8 decades more, long after your individual name is forgotten. The dangerous hope that still believed in better futures. "What's your name?" he asked. I almost laughed. "Doesn't matter. You won't be using it much longer if you join. You'll be Rust Viper. Whatever role you prove suited for, that'll be your identity, function, and family. Nothing more, nothing less." "And if I refuse? If I decide to try something else? Then you walk away now, and we never had this conversation. The choice is always yours. That's what we offer. Real choice, real responsibility for that choice. Most people in the Hive never get to choose their lives. We do. It's just that all our choices involve different forms of suffering." He thought about it, his eyes tracking the patrol moving through the corridor with practiced efficiency. Seeing what I saw: order in chaos, purpose in violence, family in what civilians considered brutality. "I want to choose," he said finally. "I want it to mean something." "Then follow me," I replied. "We'll start with the oath. Then scarification. Then the proving. If you survive all 3, you'll be Rust Viper. If you don't, you'll be recycled alongside the enemies you failed to kill." As we walked toward the den, I thought about Lissa approaching me 5 years ago, offering the same choice with the same brutal honesty. Thought about Vex training me, Kane promoting me, the endless cycle of recruitment and death and replacement that kept the gang functional. I was 24 years old. I would probably be dead by 30. But between now and then, I would train dozens of recruits, would pass forward everything Lissa and Vex had taught me, would add my own knowledge to the archives, would serve until the gang no longer needed me or until circumstances required my sacrifice. And then someone else would inherit my positions, would carry the same knowledge, would train the next generation with the same brutal honesty and careful attention. The wheel would turn forever. I was born in darkness. I would die in darkness. I had never seen the sun, and I never would. But I had seen the faces of my brothers by the light of burning corpses, and in that moment I understood what it meant to be human. We were not the forgotten. We were the foundation. The Imperium stood on our backs, and we bore the weight without complaint, because someone must. Because in the darkness we found something the Upper Hive would never know. We found each other. And that was enough. It had to be enough, because it was all we would ever have.